The alarm did not sound like an alarm. That was the first wrongness of it, and it was Demiurge who noticed the shape of the wrongness before he understood its meaning. The way, in the 9th floor's vast administrative chamber, the ambient hum of Nazarick's monitoring ward simply stopped for the span of a single heartbeat, as though the entire dungeon had drawn in a breath it did not know how to release. Every device built to watch the world beyond Nazarick's walls, the scrying pools, the runic maps threaded through with the mana signatures of every notable being within 1,000 leagues, the long, patient lattice of detection magic that Ainz Ooal Gown had spent years layering across the Sorceress Kingdom's borders, flickered, together, as one. Then they came back on, and every reading was wrong. Not wrong in the way a corrupted spell was wrong, with jagged static and broken glyphs. Wrong in the way a held note goes wrong when it slides, smoothly and without apology, into a key that should not exist in the same scale. The mana signature detection wards, calibrated across years to register everything from a Tier 1 goblin shaman to the ambient hum of a world item, produced a single reading from a patch of open grassland 3 days' ride northeast of Erantel, and then, having produced it, seemed almost to recoil from their own instrument. The number was not a number. It was an absence shaped like a presence, as if something had stepped into the world that the world's own laws had no vocabulary to measure, and the wards, built to quantify power, could only report that quantification itself had failed. Demiurge stood very still for a long moment, adjusting his glasses with one clawed finger, and felt, for the first time since Nazarick had descended into this world, something that was not quite fear. It was closer to the reverent stillness of a man realizing, mid-sentence, that the ground beneath the conversation had never been ground at all. He notified the Supreme One within the minute. Ainz Ooal Gown received the report in the great throne room, seated upon the dais built for 41 gods, who no longer walked this world, flanked as always by Albedo at his right hand, and, summoned in haste, Shaltir and Cocytus arrayed below the steps. The crimson lights of his eye sockets did not flicker. The Lich's face allowed for no visible alarm, whatever moved beneath the skeletal calm. But Albedo, who had spent longer than anyone alive studying the smallest cadence of her master's silences, felt the pause stretch a half-second longer than it should have. "Show me," Ainz said. Demiurge gestured, and the projection bloomed above the dais. A shimmering window into the grassland Nazarick's wards had flagged, rendered through captured mana resonance rather than true sight, since true sight had, notably, refused to resolve properly at all. What appeared was strange in a way none of them, not even Ainz with his memories of a world of high technology and stranger fictions, could immediately place. Two silhouettes, one seated cross-legged on empty air as though a throne existed beneath him, that the projection could not render, the other standing attendant beside him, with a staff in hand, both simply present, in the manner of things that had not traveled to a place so much as decided, absently, to exist there instead. "Foreign," Cocytus said, his four-armed frame shifting with the discipline of a soldier assessing a battlefield he did not yet understand. Not of tier magic, not of any casting signature this one recognizes. It could be a world item's effect, Shaltir offered, though her voice carried less certainty than her usual brash confidence. Something we have not yet catalogued. Ainz said nothing for a long moment, turning the image slowly in his mind, running through the long catalogue of knowledge he had carried from his old world. Power scaling systems, cosmic hierarchies, the outer edges of speculative fiction he had once consumed as idle entertainment, searching for a shape that fit what the wards were struggling to describe. Nothing fit cleanly, but something in the quality of the absence nagged at him, a half-formed echo of stories about beings who existed above the mechanics of a setting entirely, arbiters rather than participants. He dismissed the thought as unproductive speculation. Speculation would not serve him here. Only information would. "We do not know what this is," Ainz said, and his voice, modulated as always into the register of unshaken command, betrayed nothing of the calculation churning beneath it, which means we do not act on assumption. Demiurge, Supreme One. Demiurge inclined his head, horns catching the pale light of the chamber. "You will go, not to engage, to observe and to classify. If it is a threat, I want to know its shape before I decide how Nazarick answers it. If it is not," Ainz paused, and this time the pause was deliberate, a king weighing the cost of every possible next sentence before permitting himself to speak it. "Then I want to know what it wants, and if it notices me before I have finished observing, then you will do what you always do, Demiurge." The faint red glow of Ainz's eyes settled on his guardian, with something almost like grim amusement. "You will make it believe you were never a threat at all, until it no longer matters whether you were." Demiurge smiled, the expression sharpening every line of his elegant, devilish face. "As you command." 3 days' ride to the northeast, in a grassland that had, until that morning, been remarkable for nothing except the quality of its wildflowers. Beerus opened one eye, sniffed the air with visible distaste, and said, "This smells like death that refuses to stay dead." Whis, floating serenely beside him with the ankh-topped staff resting easily in one hand, considered the statement with the mild interest of a man being told about weather in a country he had no plans to visit. "That would be an accurate description, Lord Beerus. There is a great deal of necromantic energy pooling beneath the surface of this world. Old, deep, and remarkably organized. Someone has been quite industrious." "Industrious?" Beerus said the word like it tasted bad. He stretched, cat-like, the long line of his tail flicking with irritation, and surveyed the rolling grassland with the profound boredom of a being who had, in the span of one afternoon, millennia ago, grown tired of entire galaxies. "I was sleeping, Whis. You are always sleeping, my lord. And yet here we are, because something woke you. Something in the flow of this little pocket of existence smelled off, like spoiled meat left out somewhere it shouldn't be." Beerus's nose wrinkled again, more precisely this time, tracking something Whis could not perceive with the same immediacy. "There, that direction. A concentration of it. Undeath, layered on undeath, layered on something that thinks it has climbed high enough to stop being afraid of me. How intriguing," Whis said, in the tone of a man remarking on a mildly pleasant tea. "Shall we investigate, or shall we return home and let it be someone else's afternoon?" Beerus was quiet for a moment, tail twitching, ears angled toward the horizon as though listening to a sound only he could hear. The low, ancient hum of a will that had built something vast and permanent out of nothing but spite for its own mortality, and dared to be proud of the accomplishment. "I'm hungry," Beerus said finally, which was, Whis understood after several eons of service, Beerus's way of announcing a decision had been made. "Let's see if this world has anything worth eating before I decide whether it's worth destroying." They did not walk. They did not fly, exactly, in any sense the new world's own flyers. Wyverns, griffins, the great dragon lords of ancient legend, would have recognized as flight. They simply moved, the way a thought moves from one idea to the next, and the grassland rearranged itself around their passage as though it, too, understood on some instinctive level that objecting would be pointless. The village of Caldearn was small, unremarkable, and entirely unprepared. It sat at the edge of Sorcerer's Kingdom territory, close enough to the old Riastai's border to still carry the scars of the war that had ended it. A scattering of rebuilt farmhouses, a modest shrine to the 4 great gods that had fallen out of active worship since the Sorcerer King's ascension, and a population of perhaps 200 souls who had, in recent years, learned to sleep soundly under the strange new peace of undead rule. They had bandits, occasionally. They had the ordinary business of harvest and weather and small grievances between neighbors. They had never had anything resembling what descended on their market square on a warm, unremarkable afternoon. It began, as these things so often do in the New World, with bandits. A raiding band out of the old borderlands, 11 men, opportunists rather than soldiers, armed with stolen blades and the kind of desperate confidence that comes from having nothing left to lose, had chosen that morning, of all mornings, to strike the village's grain stores. They had gotten as far as setting fire to the miller's cart, when the air above the square simply changed. Beerus did not announce himself. Gods of destruction rarely feel the need. He simply arrived, seated on nothing, an expression of profound and specific annoyance crossing his face, as the smell of burning grain reached him. Fire, he said, to no one in particular, over food. In a village that clearly doesn't have much of it to spare. He looked down at the bandit leader, a broad, scarred man named Nothing Worth Recording, who had frozen mid-swing with his stolen blade raised over a fallen farmer's head, with the flat, unimpressed contempt of a creature who found true cruelty tiresome rather than interesting. "Do you have any idea," Beerus continued, almost conversationally, "how many worlds I have seen end because someone decided scarcity gave them permission to be small? It's always the same story. It's boring." The bandit leader, to his eventual and brief credit, did not have time to be confused before he ceased, entirely and without residue to exist. Not killed, erased, the specific violet-tinged nothing of a Hakai left hanging in the air where a man had stood a moment before, the way a held breath leaves no mark once released. His men scattered, and Beerus watched them run with an expression that suggested he had already lost interest in the entire affair, his attention drifting instead toward the smell of the miller's burning grain, which he found, on reflection, mildly offensive on principle, and extinguished, with a negligent flick of 2 fingers, that also, incidentally, uncharred every grain of wheat back to its original state, because destroying good food was, to Beerus, a far graver sin than destroying a mediocre man. Whis, drifting down beside him, surveyed the shaken villagers, who had not screamed, could not quite process what they had witnessed, and were beginning instead the low, disbelieving murmur of people trying to convince themselves they were not dreaming, with polite, detached interest. "You've made an impression," Whis observed. "I made a mess disappear," Beerus corrected, already bored again, eyes drifting toward the horizon where the low black shape of a distant spire, Nazarick's outer keep, visible even at this distance, to a being who could, if he chose, perceive the curvature of entire star systems, sat waiting, like an insult he had not yet decided to answer. "That thing is still there, still smelling like it thinks it's earned the right to ignore me. Shall we pay it a visit then?" Beerus considered the spire for a long moment, tail curling with something that was not quite anticipation and not quite contempt, the particular, dangerous patience of a god who has all the time that exists and has simply chosen, for now, to spend a little of it being curious. "Not yet," he said. "Let it come to me first. Things that build thrones like that always send someone to look before they send someone to fight. I want to see which one Nazarick sends." Word of what had happened in Caldearn reached the Sorceress Kingdom's administrative network within hours, not through Nazarick's magical wards this time, but through the older, slower, more human channel of a terrified farmer riding through the night to the nearest garrison, babbling about a demon god who unmade a man without a word, and put out a fire by wishing it gone. Reports like this were common enough in a kingdom ruled by the undead. Officials had learned to treat panic testimony with professional skepticism. This report, however, reached Demiurge's desk within the hour. cross-referenced automatically against the anomalous ward's failure from 3 days prior, and the devil read it twice in silence before setting it down with unusual care, as a man might set down something he had only just realized was made of glass. He had been 3 days from Caldearn when the wards first failed. He had covered the distance in considerably less time than that, and arrived to find the village's grain stores intact, its bandits reduced to a rumor, and a patch of grass subtly wrong in a way his own considerable magical senses could not fully parse, and its people speaking, in hushed and reverent tones already curdling toward superstition, of a purple-furred god who had looked at cruelty and found it merely boring. Demiurge stood at the edge of the scorched then unscorched grain cart for a long time, turning his glasses so the light caught them and hid, as it always did, whatever expression moved behind his eyes. He did not go to the spire yet. He had not been given leave to engage, only to observe and to classify, and every instinct honed across his long service to the Supreme One told him that whatever had done this was not finished being observed, was in fact, in some manner he could not fully articulate, waiting to be watched. So he watched. He gathered testimony, cross-referenced the ward's failed readings against Caldearn's own account, and began, with the meticulous patience of a scholar assembling a monster from fragments of bone, the first true report Nazarick would receive on the being that had entered their world. He did not yet have a name for it. He would not, for 2 more days, learn that the New World's own oldest legends, buried in fragments across 6 defunct religious texts, dismissed by modern scholars as allegory, spoke of destroyer gods, who existed not as rulers of any single realm, but as a check upon the vanity of every realm that dared imagine itself permanent. But he wrote, in his final line to Ainz Ooal Gown that night, a sentence that would prove, in the sections of history yet to unfold, to be the truest thing anyone in Nazarick said about Beerus for a very long while. It does not want our world, Supreme One. It is testing whether our world deserves to keep existing, and it has not yet decided. Ainz Ooal Gown read Demiurge's report 3 times before he permitted himself to move. This was not, strictly, a habit born of caution. It was a habit born of the particular terror that lived beneath every decision he had made since arriving in this world. The terror of a man who understood, with a clarity none of his floor guardians could fully share, that he was not actually the genius strategist they believed him to be. He was a salaryman who had once played a game very seriously. Every triumph since then had been assembled from a patchwork of guildmates' old plans, borrowed knowledge, and the sheer unearned advantage of arriving in a world calibrated for people far weaker than a maxed-level guildmaster. He had built an empire on the strength of that gap. He had never, not once, faced a report that described something for which the gap did not exist, something his knowledge, however vast, could not immediately place on any scale he understood. It does not want our world. It is testing whether our world deserves to keep existing, and it has not yet decided. He set the parchment down on the obsidian arm of his throne and, for a long moment, did nothing at all, because there was nothing in his memory, not from his old world's games, not from the deep well of forum theory crafting and player lore he had once absorbed for entertainment, not from any battle Nazarick had fought since descending into this world, that offered him a framework for a being who erased a man not out of anger or strategy, but out of something closer to aesthetic disapproval. Villains he understood, rivals he understood, beings whose power outstripped his own, even those he understood, in the abstract, the way a man understands that the sea is larger than his boat without needing to have crossed it, but a being who judged, who tested worlds for whether they deserved to continue existing, and who might, on a whim, simply decide against Nazarick's right to be. That was not a category of threat. That was a category of ending. Albedo. His voice did not shake. It never shook. That was, perhaps, the one true skill he had cultivated across every crisis this world had thrown at him. The skill of sounding certain long enough for the people around him to become certain too. Summon the guardians, all of them, and send word to Sebas. I want the situation in the Sorcerer's Kingdom's capital quietly stabilized. If word of Caldearn spreads before we understand what we're dealing with, I do not want panic compounding an already impossible variable. At once, my lord! Albedo's golden eyes lingered on him a moment longer than necessary, long enough that Ainz understood, with the particular exhaustion of a man perpetually performing confidence for an audience that loved him too much to see through it, that she had noticed the pause in the throne room's air just as clearly as he had felt it himself. They gathered within the hour, Albedo at his right hand as always. Demiurge returned by teleportation from Caldearn with dust from the grassland still faintly clinging to his immaculate suit. Shaltir, restless and unusually quiet at the base of the dais. Cocytus, standing with the patient stillness of a soldier who had already resolved to die well if the situation required it, and, summoned specifically for this council, Sebastian, whose calm, unshakable presence Ainz had learned to rely on, precisely because it never wavered. Not even now. Tell them what you told me, Ainz said to Demiurge. Demiurge recounted it. The ward's failure, the reading that was an absence shaped like a presence, Caldearn's grain saved and its bandit unmade in the same negligent gesture, the villager's testimony of a purple-furred figure who spoke of boredom and cruelty and worlds ending in the same idle breath. He did not embellish. He did not need to. The account, delivered plainly, carried its own weight. A god, Shaltir said, when he finished, and there was something almost hungry in the way she said it, an old vampiric appetite for a worthy opponent rising past the fear the report should reasonably have provoked in her. A true god, not a mortal calling itself one. We do not know that, Cocytus said, his forearms shifting with careful discipline. This one has fought false gods before, beings who borrowed the title without earning the power behind it. This one earned it, Demiurge said quietly, and something in his tone, the theatrical confidence stripped briefly away, made even Shaltir go still. I have spent my existence learning to recognize the shape of a bluff, Cocytus. There was no bluff in that village. The man it erased did not die. He was subtracted. I found no trace of him. Not a body, not residual mana, not even the faint necromantic echo that lingers after any death in this world. The echo we ourselves could raise as an undead if we wished it. There was nothing to raise. There was nothing left to be anything at all. The throne room was quiet for a long moment. Even Albedo, whose devotion to Ainz manifested most often as a kind of serene, unshakable confidence in his ability to weather anything, felt the particular cold of that silence settle into her bones. Resurrection magic, Ainz said slowly, working through the implication with the deliberate care of a man testing ice before placing his full weight on it, operates on the principle that death leaves a soul intact somewhere to be retrieved. Nazarick's floor guardians, our own casters, even the world-class items, they all work from that same foundation. If this being's power erases past that foundation, then nothing in our arsenal touches it, Demiurge finished. And for once, there was no relish in delivering the grim conclusion. Not the ring of Ainz Ooal Gown's resurrection function, not the Nazarick treasury's greatest relics, not the Supreme One's own considerable power. If it chooses to erase something, that erasure is, as far as I have been able to determine, final. Sebas, who had said nothing until now, finally spoke, his voice carrying the same measured calm it always did, though something in the set of his jaw suggested the calm was, for once, a choice, rather than a nature. Then the question is not how we fight it. The question is why. In an entire village of frightened, defenseless people, it chose to erase only the man, actively committing violence against them, and spared everyone else. A being with no capacity for restraint would have needed no such distinction. The room turned toward him. It was, Ainz reflected, exactly the kind of observation Sabas had always been suited to make. Not the strategist's question of how do we survive this, but the more patient, more human question of what does this tell us about what it wants? You're suggesting it has a code, Albedo said, skeptical. I'm suggesting, Sabas replied, that it has taste, which may be a more dangerous thing to reckon with than a code, because taste can be indulged, offended, or bored, and none of those are things we can strategize against with force. Ainz turned this over in the long silence of his own mind, the calculating machinery beneath his calm exterior, running through implication after implication, and arrived, with the particular dread of a man recognizing his own strategy failing before he had even deployed it, at a conclusion he did not want to voice aloud. Everything Nazarick had ever won, it had won through preparation, through knowing an enemy's mechanics, its weaknesses, its predictable shape, and countering them before the fight began. Every floor guardian's strength, every world item in the treasury, every strategy Ainz had ever executed, was built on the foundational assumption that power, however vast, obeyed rules that could eventually be learned. This was the first threat he had faced that might not. We will not approach it as an enemy, Ainz said finally, and every guardian in the room straightened at the shift in his tone. Not fear exactly, but the particular gravity of a king who had just understood the true size of the board he was playing on. Not yet. Sabas is right. It showed restraint it did not need to show. That is information, and information is the only advantage we currently possess. Demiurge, you will make contact, carefully, respectfully, without a hint of threat in your approach. I want to know what it wants from this world before I decide what Nazarick can afford to offer, resist, or lose. And if it decides mid-conversation, Shaltir asked, quiet for once, that Nazarick itself smells like something that shouldn't exist. Ainz did not answer immediately. In the crimson dark of his eye sockets, something that might, in a living man, have been the flicker of genuine fear, passed unseen behind the fixed calm of a skull that could not change expression. Then, he said finally, we will learn, for the first time since I came to this world, what it truly means to face something I cannot outplan. 3 leagues from Caldearn, in a clearing carpeted with wildflowers that had, with the specific and slightly absurd luck of things standing near gods, been entirely spared the disruption of Beerus's arrival, Weiss was preparing food. This was, admittedly, an unusual sentence to describe what an angel attendant to a god of destruction actually did with his time, but Weiss had long ago concluded that keeping Beerus fed, entertained, and mildly diverted from destructive impulses was 90% of his actual professional duties, and he approached the task with the same serene competence he brought to everything else. He had, through a combination of careful investigation and his own considerable culinary skill, produced a meal from local ingredients, some kind of river fish, wild tubers, a handful of herbs gathered from the same field the bandits had so recently disrupted, and presented it to Beerus, with the calm ceremony of a man serving a king who had, in point of fact, outranked kings for longer than most kingdoms had existed. Beerus ate in silence for a while, tail curled comfortably beneath him, expression unreadable in the specific way that meant he was actually paying close attention to something. It's decent, he said finally, which from Beerus was closer to genuine praise than most beings ever received. Not as good as the earth dishes, but decent. This world has good bones for cooking, even if the people don't know what to do with them yet. High praise, my lord. Weiss settled beside him, staff across his lap, and followed Beerus's gaze toward the distant black spire, still visible on the horizon, still radiating that low, deep wrongness that had first disturbed Beerus's sleep. "You've been watching it for some time now. It's patient," Beerus said, and there was something almost like respect buried in the flat statement. "Whatever's inside that thing knows I'm here. It hasn't panicked. It hasn't sent an army. It's thinking, carefully, the way something thinks when it knows it might be outmatched, and refuses to let that stop it from trying anyway." He picked at the last piece of fish, considering, "I've destroyed worlds full of things that panicked the moment they sensed me. Whole civilizations that folded the instant they understood what I was. This one hasn't folded. Do you find that reassuring or troubling?" "Neither." Beerus's ears flicked, and for a moment, the boredom that governed most of his existence gave way to something sharper. The old, patient curiosity of a being who had, across eons, learned to recognize the rare thing worth actually paying attention to. "I find it interesting, and it's been a very, very long time since anything in any universe has managed that." He rose, brushing invisible crumbs from his tunic with the unhurried grace of a predator who had already decided the hunt was not yet worth beginning. "Whatever it sends to talk to me, and it will send something, soon. I can feel it deciding to. I want to actually listen, not because I owe this place anything." His golden eyes flicked toward the spire one more time, something almost fond and almost lethal in equal measure crossing his expression. "But because a world that builds a throne for 41 dead gods, and doesn't panic when a living one shows up at its door, has earned at least a conversation, before I decide whether it's earned anything more." Whis smiled, small and knowing, and began quietly gathering the remains of the meal. "I'll let the universe know you're feeling generous today, my lord. It happens so rarely, someone should mark the occasion." "Don't push it," Beerus said, without any real heat behind it, and settled back into his cross-legged seat upon the empty air, waiting, with the vast, unhurried patience of a god who had all the time that existed, for whatever Nazarick chose to send him next. Demiurge arrived at the clearing an hour before dusk, and he arrived, deliberately, on foot. It would have been simpler to teleport directly into Beerus's presence. Nazarick's magic afforded him that convenience easily enough, but Demiurge had spent long enough as a devil among devils, negotiating hells both literal and political, to understand that the manner of an approach often mattered as much as its content. A god who tested worlds for whether they deserved to continue existing would notice the difference between a supplicant who respected the ground he walked on and one who simply appeared, uninvited, in another being's space. So he walked, out of the tree line and across the wildflower field, robes immaculate, despite the 2 days of travel and observation behind him, glasses catching the low amber light of the setting sun, and made no effort at all to hide his approach. Whis noticed him first, of course he did, and inclined his head with polite, unbothered interest, the way a man might greet an expected guest arriving slightly early to a dinner party. "Lord Beerus, it seems we have company." Beerus opened one eye. He did not move from his cross-legged seat on empty air, did not so much as shift his tail, and regarded the approaching devil with the flat, assessing patience of a predator who had already decided this particular creature posed no threat worth the effort of standing up for. "You're the one that's been watching me," Beerus said, before Demiurge had come within 20 paces. "For 2 days. From a distance, mostly. Though you got closer in Caldearn than you probably think I noticed." Demiurge stopped and allowed himself, carefully, deliberately, a small, respectful smile. "I did not think you had not noticed, Lord." He paused, correctly reading the absence of an offered name as a test rather than an oversight, and chose his next words with the precision of a man diffusing something that could unmake him, without expending any real effort. "Forgive me. I do not yet know how you wish to be addressed. I did not wish to presume a title I had not earned the right to use. Something in Beerus's expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, but the faint, genuine flicker of a being surprised by a stranger's manners. "Beerus," he said, "God of destruction, Universe 7, and this," he added, with a lazy gesture toward Whis, "is Whis. Angel attendant, my teacher in all the ways that matter, and considerably more dangerous than I am, if it ever came to that, which it never will, because he's annoyingly disciplined about staying out of things. An honor," Whis said serenely, in the tone of a man who had heard that particular introduction many times, and found it perpetually amusing. Demiurge inclined his head low, not a full bow, which would have read as either mockery or desperation, but the precise, calibrated depth of respect one power grants another, whose scale it has not yet fully measured. "I am Demiurge, floor guardian of the 7th floor of the great tomb of Nazarick, and I come at the direction of my master, Ainz Ooal Gown, ruler of the Sorcerer's kingdom." He straightened, meeting Beerus's golden eyes directly, a small, deliberate act of courage, since he understood, with total clarity, exactly how little his own considerable power would matter if this conversation went wrong. "I was sent not to challenge you, Lord Beerus, nor to threaten you. I was sent to listen, and, if you are willing, to understand what has brought a god to our world, and what he might require of it." Beerus studied him for a long moment, tail flicking once, twice, with the unhurried rhythm of a creature turning a puzzle over in his mind. "You're a diplomat," he said finally, and there was something almost approving in the observation. "A devil who plays diplomat. That's a rarer thing than you'd think, across every universe I've bothered to notice. Most devils just want to see how much they can take before someone stops them." "I find," Demiurge said, permitting the faintest edge of genuine personality to color his careful formality, "that the correct application of intelligence achieves far more than the indiscriminate application of cruelty, Lord Beerus. Cruelty is common. Understanding an opponent well enough to know precisely when not to be cruel, that, I find, is the rarer and more useful skill." Beerus laughed, a short, surprised bark of genuine amusement that seemed to startle even Whis slightly, given how rarely his master found anything worth an actual laugh. "I like him," Beerus said, to no one in particular, then fixed his gaze back on Demiurge with renewed, sharper interest. "Sit down, diplomat. You've earned a conversation. Let's see if your king built something worth my continued patience, or if I'm about to be disappointed the way I usually am." They spoke for the better part of 2 hours, and Demiurge, trained across a long existence to read the smallest tells of intention beneath even the most guarded words, understood within the first 20 minutes that he was in the presence of something categorically different from anything Nazarick had faced before, and understood, within the first hour, that the situation was somehow both more dangerous and less immediately dire than he had feared. Beerus was not, he came to realize, interested in conquest. He had no armies to feed, no throne to expand, no vendetta against mortal kingdoms that dared to organize themselves without his permission. His interest, as far as Demiurge could parse it, was almost aesthetic, a connoisseur's idle curiosity about whether a given corner of existence had earned the right to keep existing, weighed against criteria that seemed to have less to do with power and more to do with something closer to worthiness, though Beerus himself seemed to find the word too grand for what he actually meant. "I don't destroy things because I hate them," Beerus said at one point, examining a wildflower he had plucked with idle, careless precision, turning it between 2 claws. "That's a mortal's mistake, thinking destruction needs a reason as small as hatred. I destroy things that have stopped being interesting, things that curdle, a civilization that starts eating itself instead of growing, A species that's forgotten what made it worth watching in the first place. That's what earns my attention, diplomat. Not power, not defiance, stagnation. And my master's kingdom, Demiurge asked, carefully. Has it curdled, in your estimation? Beerus considered this with genuine, unhurried thought, tossing the flower aside. I don't know yet. That's the honest answer. I felt something wrong in the flow of this place. Old death, layered and organized in a way that shouldn't hold together as neatly as it does. That's what woke me. But wrong isn't the same as curdled. Wrong just means I hadn't seen it before. His golden eyes fixed on Demiurge with sudden, sharpened focus. Tell me about your king, not his armies, not his power. Tell me what he actually wants, underneath all of it. Demiurge chose his words with exceptional care, understanding, with total clarity, that whatever answer he gave now would likely shape everything that followed. My master, he said slowly, built Nazarick's order out of a desire that I do not believe he has ever fully admitted, even to himself. The desire to matter to a world he did not choose, and to protect the few things from his old existence that he could carry with him into this one. Everything else, the conquest, the calculated fear, the careful architecture of a kingdom built on absolute control, is, I believe, a shell constructed around that single, more fragile motive. He rules through control, because control is the only language he trusts not to betray him. There was a long silence. Wyss, who had said very little throughout the exchange, glanced sidelong at Beerus with the faint, knowing interest of a man watching his companion actually think, rather than merely react. That, Beerus said finally, is either the most honest thing anyone has said to me in about 400 years, or the single best constructed lie I've heard in just as long. I genuinely can't tell which yet, diplomat, and that's rare enough that I find I want to find out. He rose, unhurried, the movement carrying the same weightless, absolute confidence that had characterized his every gesture since Demiurge's arrival, and looked toward the black spire on the horizon, now fully dark against a sky gone deep violet with the last of the sunset. Tell your king this, Beerus said. I'm not here to destroy his kingdom. Not today. Not for the reasons he's probably afraid of. But I am going to see it myself. Walk through it. Look at what he's built. Decide with my own eyes whether it's worth the space it occupies. And I want him there when I do. Not hiding behind guardians. Not sending emissaries to buy him time to prepare countermeasures I'd see through anyway. Something sharp and genuinely dangerous entered his voice for the first time in the entire conversation. The first real glimpse, Demiurge understood, of the being who could erase a man without a word. If he sends anyone but himself to greet me at his own front door, diplomat, I will take that as an answer. And it will not be the answer he wants me to have taken. Demiurge bowed, fully, this time, the deep formal bow of a devil who understood exactly how much had just been offered, and exactly how much would be lost if it were mishandled. I will deliver your words precisely, Lord Beerus, and I believe, he added, straightening, allowing himself one final flicker of genuine, calculated honesty, that my master will come. Not because he is without fear, but because he has never yet been the kind of king who sends others to face what he will not face himself. Beerus's ears flicked, something unreadable moving behind his golden eyes. Good, he said, because that, diplomat, is exactly the kind of thing that decides whether a thing curdles or whether it grows. Demiurge returned to Nazarick beneath a sky gone fully dark. The walk back through the wildflower field feeling, for the first time in longer than he could easily recall, like the walk of a man who had survived something by the narrowest and most fragile of margins, not because Beerus had threatened him precisely, but because he understood now, with total and sobering clarity, exactly how thin the thread was upon which Nazarick's continued existence currently hung. He delivered his report to Ainz Ooal Gown in the throne room, in full, sparing no detail. The criteria of stagnation, the strange respect Beerus had shown for honesty over strength, and the ultimatum, delivered without malice but without any room for negotiation either. Come yourself, or be judged as a king who hides. When he finished, the throne room was silent for a long time. Ainz sat motionless upon his dais, crimson eyelights fixed on some middle distance none of the assembled guardians could follow, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight Demiurge had rarely heard in it before. Not the practiced calm of a strategist, but something closer to the quiet resolve of a man who understood, fully, that he was about to walk into a room with no plan that could save him if the answer went wrong. Then I will go, Ainz said, alone, as it demands, and we will learn, once and for all, whether everything I have built in this world is worth the space it occupies. Albedo broke the silence first, stepping forward with a sharpness that cut through the throne room's held breath like a blade. Alone is not acceptable, my lord. Let me attend you. Let me stand at your side, as I always. No. Ainz's refusal was immediate, and gentler than his usual commands, which somehow made it land harder. It did not ask for my strength, Albedo. It asked whether I was a king who hides behind others' strength instead of standing in my own name. If I bring you, I have already answered its question, and answered it badly. He rose from the throne, the motion slow and deliberate, a man gathering himself before a reckoning he could not delegate to anyone else, however desperately he might have wished to. Prepare the kingdom quietly. If I do not return, Nazarick's continuity falls to the Guardians' Council, as we have always planned. But I intend to return, and when I do, I intend for our world to still be standing behind me. Shaltir's hand tightened, unconsciously, around the haft of her spear. Cocytus bowed his head, low and formal, the gesture of a soldier honoring a commander, walking toward a battle he could not fight beside him. And Demiurge, watching his king descend the dais, steps toward a meeting that might end everything Nazarick had built, felt, for the second time in 2 days, something that was not quite fear, and was not quite hope, but sat, uneasy and electric, somewhere in the narrow space between them. Tomorrow, at dawn, the god of destruction would walk through the gates of the great tomb of Nazarick, and Ainz Ooal Gown would learn, at last, whether every careful plan he had ever made meant anything at all against a judgment that could not be strategized against, only met, honestly, on its own terms, by a king with nothing left to hide behind but himself. Dawn came to the sorceress kingdom the way it always did, pale gold light climbing over the eastern hills, mist curling off the wide irrigation canals that fed Erantel's outlying farmland, the ordinary business of roosters and cartwheels and market stalls beginning to stir in the streets below the great black shadow of Nazarick's spire. None of the kingdom's ordinary citizens knew what was coming. That, Ainz reflected, standing alone at the base of the tomb's outer gate, with the morning cold settling through armor that no longer felt cold or warm to the body wearing it, was itself a small mercy. Whatever happened in the next hour, at least it would happen without 200,000 people watching and understanding, in real time, whether their god-king had been weighed and found wanting. He had dismissed every guardian from the courtyard, over Albedo's badly concealed anguish, and Shaltir's barely restrained protest. He had ordered Sabes to keep the Pleiades on standby but out of sight, ready to act only if the situation degraded past any hope of diplomacy, though privately, and with the particular bleak clarity of a man who had spent a sleepless night running through every scenario his mind could construct. Ainz understood that if things degraded that far, the Pleiades' readiness would matter about as much as a child's toy sword. He stood alone. He had asked for this, and he had gotten it, and now there was nothing left to do but wait. Beerus arrived without fanfare, precisely as the sun cleared the hills, not walking through the gate, not descending from the sky in some display of arrival, but simply there, seated cross-legged on empty air a few feet above the courtyard stones, Whis floating serenely at his shoulder, as though the two of them had always occupied that particular patch of morning light, and the rest of the world had simply failed, until now, to notice. "You came alone," Beerus said, and there was no praise in his tone. "Exactly, but no disappointment either. Only the flat, assessing note of a fact being logged." "Good start. You asked for a king who does not hide," Ainz said. His voice, modulated as always into unshaken calm, betrayed nothing of the vertiginous terror sitting beneath it. The specific terror of a man who understood that every advantage he had ever possessed in this world, every careful preparation, every hoarded relic and layered strategy, meant precisely nothing here, in this courtyard, in front of this being. "I did not become the kind of king who sends others to answer for what I have built." Beerus studied him for a long moment, not with magic, not with any of the elaborate sensory tools Nazarick's own casters might have used to probe a subject, but with something older and simpler and, Ainz suspected, considerably more accurate. The plain, unhurried attention of a being who had spent longer than civilizations existed, learning to see straight through performance to the thing underneath it. "You're not what I expected," Beerus said finally. "I expected a tyrant. Every ruler who builds something like that, a lazy gesture toward the black spire looming above them both, usually is. Instead, I get a skeleton who's more afraid of me than he is of dying twice, and is still standing here anyway." He tilted his head, ears angling with genuine curiosity. "Why?" Ainz was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, he found, with some surprise at himself, that the answer that rose to his throat was not a strategist's answer, not a carefully constructed diplomatic response weighed for maximum advantage, but something closer to the truth than he had permitted himself to voice aloud in a very long time. "Because I have already lost everything I was afraid of losing once," Ainz said. "The guild I came from, the people I called friends before this world took them from me, one by one, until only I remained to carry what we built. I built Nazarick's order in this world not because I wanted to rule it, Lord Beerus, but because I did not know how to exist without something to protect, and an empire was the only shape large enough to hold the fear of losing everything again. If you have come to judge whether that is worth the space it occupies," his crimson eyelights held steady, unblinking, on the god before him, "then judge it honestly. I would rather you erase me for the truth of what I built than spare me for a lie." The courtyard was silent. Even Whis, who had drifted through this exact kind of moment countless times across countless worlds, watched with something that might, in a being of his composure, have passed for genuine interest. Beerus's tail flicked once, twice, and then, slowly, something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly. Beerus was not built for warmth in any way a mortal would easily recognize, but a kind of grudging, genuine respect that sat strangely on a face more accustomed to boredom and appetite. "Most kings," Beerus said, "lie to me about why they built what they built. Even the honest ones usually lie by accident. They've told the story about their own ambitions so many times they've started believing the flattering version themselves. You didn't do that." He floated down, unhurried, until his feet, such as they were, rested lightly on the courtyard stones, bringing him, for the first time, to something close to eye level, with the Lich standing before him. "Show me your kingdom, Ainz Ooal Gown, not the throne room, not the treasury, or the army, or whatever grand display you'd normally put in front of someone you wanted to impress. Show me what you actually built underneath all of it. Show me the parts you didn't build to be seen." What followed, across the long, strange morning that stretched into afternoon, was unlike anything Ainz had prepared for, in all his sleepless hours of contingency planning the night before. Beerus did not want the throne room, though Ainz offered it. He did not want the treasury of world items, though its existence alone would, by any reasonable measure, have justified genuine caution from any rational threat assessment. He wanted the ninth floor's administrative chambers, where clerks, both human officials absorbed from the old Riestes bureaucracy and Nazarick's own homunculus maids, processed the grinding, unglamorous machinery of actually governing a kingdom. Grain distribution during a lean season, a dispute between two demi-human settlements over grazing rights, the slow, patient work of rebuilding roads shattered during the war that had ended Riestes' sovereignty. He wanted the outer farmland, where he watched, with an attention that unsettled Ainz more than any threat display could have, as a Sorcerer Kingdom agricultural officer, a former Riestes commoner, promoted on merit under the new order in a way the old kingdom's rigid nobility would never have permitted, explained irrigation improvements to a cluster of skeptical farmers with the patient, unhurried thoroughness of someone who genuinely believed the details mattered. "Your undead don't rule through terror alone," Beerus observed, at one point, watching a group of villagers interact with a low-tier skeleton guard, with the easy, unafraid familiarity of people who had simply gotten used to it. "They've stopped being afraid. That's rarer than you'd think, for a kingdom built on the kind of power you hold. Fear is easy to build. Fear that fades into ordinary trust. That takes longer, and it takes choices a tyrant usually isn't willing to make." "I did not intend that outcome," Ainz admitted, another truth he had not planned to offer, drawn out of him by something in the god's plain, patient questioning that made performance feel not just useless, but somehow beneath the moment. "I intended control, order, predictability, because predictability was the only thing that let me sleep, if I can be said to sleep, without fearing the collapse of everything I had built. That the people stopped fearing it in the process was an accident of governing carefully, rather than governing cruelly. The best things usually are accidents of doing something carefully instead of cruelly," Beerus said, and there was something almost fond in his voice now, a warmth so foreign to his usual register that even Wiss's serene composure flickered with faint, genuine surprise. "I've destroyed a lot of empires that never had that accident happen to them. Ainz Ooal Gown. Empires built on nothing but the cruelty, all the way down, with no careful thing underneath it worth salvaging." He stopped walking, turning to face the lich fully, golden eyes carrying a weight that made the air itself feel momentarily thinner. "Yours has one. That matters more to me than every world item in your treasury combined." Ainz felt something in his chest that he no longer technically possessed loosen, fractionally, not relief, not yet, the terror of the morning far too deeply lodged to fully release on a single sentence, however promising. "Then you have decided," he said carefully. "Nazarick will be permitted to stand." Beerus's expression shifted again, and this time the shift carried a note of genuine warning that made every instinct in Ainz's long-dormant human memory scream caution. "I said it matters," Beerus corrected, voice cooling several degrees. "I haven't decided anything yet. A kingdom can have one careful, honest thing at its foundation and still curdle around it, the way rot spreads from a single soft spot in good fruit. I want to see more before I decide whether this is a place that's still growing or a place that's already started to rot and just hasn't noticed the smell yet." His tail flicked, and for the first time since the encounter began, something genuinely dangerous entered his tone. The low, patient promise of a god whose judgment was not yet finished being rendered. "Show me your slain theocracy. Show me the empire you call an ally. Show me the parts of this world you haven't built, the parts that exist despite you, or because of you, or in spite of everything you've tried to control. I want to see the whole shape of what you've made this world into before I decide what it's earned." Ainz bowed his head, not in submission, but in the particular, weighted acknowledgement of a king who understood, with total and sobering clarity, that the true test had not yet even begun. "Then I will show you," Ainz said. "All of it, whatever the cost of that honesty turns out to be." They traveled the following morning by a means Ainz found himself unable to fully classify, and which he suspected, with growing unease, he would never be able to replicate for any other purpose. Beerus simply asked where the Baharuth Empire's capital lay, and the world folded itself around the question, delivering the three of them to a hillside overlooking the imperial city of Arwintar, within the space of a single, disorienting instant. Whis, drifting beside them with his usual unbothered calm, offered the mild observation that Lord Beerus generally found conventional travel tedious past the first 10,000 years or so, which did nothing to settle the vertiginous unease still working its way through what remained of Ainz's borrowed human instincts. "Your ally," Beerus said, surveying the sprawling capital below, its stone walls, its bustling trade quarter, the distant glint of the imperial palace's gilded roof catching the morning sun. "Tell me about him, not the treaty." "The man, Emperor Jerkniv Rune Farlord El Nix," Ainz said, and found himself choosing his words with unusual care, aware now of exactly how much weight every honest sentence carried in front of this particular audience. A young ruler who inherited an empire built on the old principle of strength justifying rule, gladiatorial combat as a filter for advancement, a court that rewards ruthlessness as readily as competence. He allied with the Sorcerer's Kingdom out of pragmatism rather than affection. He fears me, correctly. He has also, in the years since, built genuine reforms into his empire's foundations, reforms he could never have risked before Nazarick's shadow gave him the political cover to attempt them. "So he uses your fear as a tool against his own court," Beerus said, something like grim appreciation in his voice. "Clever. Cowardly, in its way, but clever. Let's meet him." They did not meet him gently. Beerus had no patience. Ainz was quickly reminded, for the elaborate ceremony of imperial audiences, and simply appeared, Ainz beside him, the pretense of formal announcement rendered instantly moot, in the middle of Jerkniv's private council chamber, mid-session, scattering 3 startled ministers and sending the Emperor's hand instinctively toward a blade he would have had no hope of using in time had the intent behind the intrusion been hostile. What followed was, by Ainz's private estimation, one of the more remarkable political performances he had witnessed in this world. Jerkniv, having recovered his composure with the speed of a ruler who had survived Nazarick's shadow long enough to develop genuine nerve, did not grovel, did not flee, and did not bluster. He simply straightened his robes, dismissed his startled ministers with a curt gesture, and addressed the god of destruction with the wary, calculating respect of a man who had learned, through hard experience, exactly how much could be lost by misjudging the size of a threat. "I don't know what you are," Jerkniv said, "but I know enough to guess that whatever brought you here is not something my empire's armies could meaningfully oppose. So I will ask plainly, what do you want from Baharuth, and what will it cost me?" Beerus studied him for a long moment, tail flicking with something that might have been amusement. "Direct," he said. "I like that more than I expected to." He gestured toward the city beyond the chamber's windows. "Tell me about your gladiator pits. I hear you still run them." Jerkniv's jaw tightened fractionally. "I do, against the advice of reformers in my own court who would prefer I abolish them entirely." "Why haven't you?" "Because abolishing them overnight would strip legitimacy from every noble house that built its standing on that system, and hand a weapon to whichever faction moved fastest to exploit the vacuum," Jerkniv said, with the flat, tired honesty of a ruler who had clearly turned the question over many times in private. I am reforming Baharuth, Lord Beerus, whatever you are, but I am reforming it the way you defuse a bomb, not the way you demolish a building, slowly, carefully, cutting the wires I can reach without triggering the ones I can't yet see. He met the god's golden eyes without flinching. If that answer disappoints you, I will not pretend otherwise to save myself. I have made my choices with my eyes open. Beerus was silent for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, laughed. The same short, genuinely surprised bark he had given Demiurge 2 days before. Another honest one, he said, glancing sidelong at Ainz with something almost like satisfaction. Your alliance has better bones than I expected, Skeleton King. A tyrant's servant lies about compromise. A reformer's servant explains it. He turned back to Jerkniv. Keep cutting the wires you can reach, Emperor. I'll be watching to see whether you actually finish the job, or whether slowly and carefully turns out to be the story you tell yourself while you run out the clock on ever finishing at all. Jerkniv inclined his head, a fraction, not submission, but the wary respect of a man who understood exactly how narrow a margin he had just survived on. I intend to finish it, Lord Beerus, whether you're watching or not. Good, Beerus said, already turning away, already visibly bored with imperial ceremony now that the actual substance of the exchange had concluded. Because I will be. The slain theocracy was a different matter entirely, and Ainz felt the shift in atmosphere the moment they arrived on the outskirts of its holy city. A colder, more brittle tension in the air, the particular hush of a nation that had lost a war and had not yet finished deciding how to feel about it. They did not meet with the theocracy's official leadership. Beerus, with an instinct Ainz was beginning to recognize as unerringly precise, seemed to sense something more honest waiting in the city's lower quarters than anything the Cardinal's council chamber would offer, and instead, they found themselves, by the god's own unhurried choice, in a modest chapel at the edge of the holy city's poorer district, where a low-ranking priest named Nicholas Berayar, a real minor cleric of the 6 great gods remaining faithful, tending a congregation that had shrunk considerably since the war's end, was distributing what little food his order could spare to a line of thin, tired parishioners. Beerus watched this in silence for some time, arms folded, expression unreadable, while Nicholas, who had gone pale and rigid the instant he registered exactly what had walked into his modest chapel, having heard the same rumors spreading through every corner of the continent by now, continued, with visibly trembling hands, to finish serving the last of his line, rather than abandon the task mid-gesture. You're afraid of me, Beerus observed, once the last parishioner had gone. But you finished feeding them first. They needed to eat, Nicholas said, voice unsteady but resolute. Whatever you intend to do to me, my lord, and I confess I do not know what that might be. It would not have changed whether they were hungry. So I finished first. Beerus's tail flicked, slow and considering. Your theocracy started a war it lost badly, he said, against the very kingdom whose king stands beside me now. Tell me honestly, priest, does your faith blame him for that loss, or does it blame the people who chose the war in the first place? Nicholas hesitated, and Ainz, watching closely, aware that this answer mattered more than any diplomatic exchange he had conducted since Beerus's arrival, saw the man visibly weigh the cost of honesty against the safety of a comfortable lie, and choose, with the same quiet resolve that had made him finish feeding his line, the honesty. Some blame him, Nicholas said, loudly and often, because it is easier to hate a foreign king than to reckon with our own leadership's failures. But I have buried too many of our own soldiers, sent to die by cardinals who believed their own righteousness would be armor enough against an undead army, to pretend the fault lies anywhere but with the men who chose that war for us. He met Beerus's gaze, pale but unbroken. I do not love the Sorcerer's Kingdom, Lord Beerus, but I have stopped pretending our own leadership was blameless for what befell us. That, I think, is the most honest thing I have to offer you." Beerus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made even Wiss's serene attention sharpen. "Your theocracy's leadership is exactly the kind of rot I've come here looking for," Beerus said, and there was no ambiguity left in his tone now, no lazy curiosity, only the flat, patient judgment of a god who had, for the first time since his arrival, found something he recognized clearly enough to condemn outright. Not because they lost a war. Losing isn't rot. Refusing to learn anything from the losing, that's rot. I've smelled it in 100 other worlds, priest. Empires that keep making the same failed choice, dressed in new justifications, because admitting the old choice was wrong would cost someone's pride more than they're willing to pay. His golden eyes flicked toward Ainz, and something in them was colder now, more focused. "Your Cardinal's counsel. I want to see it next." Ainz felt the weight of what was coming settle over him like a physical thing. "They will not receive us peacefully," he said carefully. "Cardinal Raymond and the zealot factions within the council have never accepted the theocracy's defeat as final. If you walk into that chamber carrying the judgment I can see forming in you now, then we'll find out exactly how far their rot goes," Beerus said, already rising, already turning toward the distant spires of the Cardinal's council hall visible above the holy city's rooftops, "and whether there's anything underneath it still worth saving, before I decide what the slain theocracy has actually earned." The Cardinal's council hall had not been rebuilt to its former grandeur since the war. A deliberate choice, Ainz understood, meant to project humility to a population still raw from defeat, though the effect achieved was closer to a wound left unhealed on purpose, worn like a grievance instead of a lesson. Scaffolding still clung to one damaged wing. The great stained glass windows depicting the 6 great gods had been only partially restored, leaving gaps of plain, unadorned glass where ancient artistry had once stood, and Ainz found something bleakly appropriate in the image, a leadership more interested in preserving the appearance of grievance than in the work of actually rebuilding what had been lost. Cardinal Raymond received them in the council chamber with a courtesy so brittle it barely qualified as courtesy at all, a thin, controlled hostility radiating from every line of his bearing, the posture of a man who had spent years cultivating a very specific, very careful hatred, and had no intention of setting it aside for a stranger's arrival, however unprecedented that stranger's power might be. 4 other members of the council flanked him, and Ainz recognized among them the tightly coiled tension of zealot faction leaders who had never accepted the theocracy's defeat as anything but a temporary humiliation to be reversed. "An undead king," Raymond said, gaze flicking to Ainz with undisguised contempt before settling, more cautiously, on Beerus. "And now a stranger claiming to be a god. Forgive us if the slain theocracy has grown weary of unearned titles, my lord. We have paid dearly for trusting things that named themselves greater than they proved to be." "Careful," Wiss murmured, so quietly only Ainz's enhanced senses caught it, though the warning was plainly not meant for Ainz at all. Beerus regarded Raymond for a long moment with the same flat, unhurried patience he had shown every figure he'd met so far, and Ainz, who had spent the last 2 days learning to read the smallest shifts in that patience, felt something cold settle in his chest at the particular quality of stillness now gathering behind the god's golden eyes. "Tell me about the war you lost," Beerus said. Raymond's jaw tightened. The Sorcerer's Kingdom's liberation of the Holy Kingdom was an act of aggression dressed as rescue. We defended our sovereign interests against an undead empire's expansion, as any nation would. "That's the speech you give your congregation," Beerus interrupted, voice still level, but carrying now an edge that made the room's temperature seem to drop several degrees. I didn't ask for the speech. I asked what happened. Tell me the truth, Cardinal, or don't waste my time pretending you have anything worth my patience. The chamber went very still. One of the flanking council members, a younger man Ainz did not recognize by name, face pale with the particular fear of someone realizing, in real time, that the room's most dangerous occupant was not the undead lich but the being standing calmly beside him, shifted his weight as though preparing to bolt. Raymond, to his limited credit, did not break so easily, but when he spoke again, something in his careful composure had cracked, just slightly, exposing the raw grievance beneath. We sent our scriptures, the finest warriors the theocracy has produced in a generation, against an enemy we did not understand and could not have understood, because no army in this world's history has ever faced what Nazarick commands. We lost good people, faithful people, and in the years since, this council has spent its energy not on rebuilding what we lost, but on preserving the belief that our cause was righteous regardless of the cost, because the alternative, admitting that righteousness was not enough, that we sent children to die for a war built on our own leadership's miscalculation, was more than any of us could bear to say aloud. The admission seemed to surprise even Raymond himself, and for a moment, something raw and genuinely grieving showed through the practiced hostility of his bearing, before he visibly forced it back down. Beerus watched this with an expression Ainz could not fully read. Not satisfaction, not yet, but something closer to the careful attention of a physician examining a wound to determine whether it might still heal. That's closer to true, Beerus said. But you still haven't told me the part that matters. Have you changed anything since the losing, or have you just kept telling the same story, louder, to drown out the part where you'd have to actually change? The silence that followed answered the question more completely than Raymond's next words managed to. There are factions within this council, Raymond admitted, quiet now, who still believe the war can be won eventually, through subterfuge, through patience, through waiting for the Sorcerer's kingdom to overextend itself. I have not always disagreed with them as strongly as I perhaps should have. There it is, Beerus said, and something final entered his voice. Not anger, not the sharp cruelty Ainz had half expected given the god's earlier warning, but a cold, absolute clarity that was, in its own way, far more unsettling. That's the rot, Cardinal. Not the losing, not even the grief. The refusal to let the losing actually teach you anything, because learning would mean admitting the deaths meant something other than righteous sacrifice. You'd rather keep feeding your people the same doomed war, one slow subterfuge at a time, than tell them the truth and let them grieve properly and move forward into something that might actually survive. And what would you have us do instead? Raymond's composure had fully cracked now, old grief and old fury spilling out in equal measure. Kneel to the undead who conquered us? Pretend the deaths of our scriptures meant nothing? I'd have you decide, Beerus said, voice dropping to something quieter and infinitely more dangerous, whether this theocracy still has anything worth saving underneath the grievance, or whether it's become nothing but the grievance, wearing an old religion's face because it forgot how to be anything else. I haven't decided that yet, Cardinal, but I will tell you plainly, I am considerably less patient with rot than I am with honesty, and you have shown me more of the former than the latter today. He turned, without further ceremony, toward the chamber's exit, and something in the finality of the gesture made even Raymond's remaining defiance falter into visible, genuine fear, for the first time since the confrontation began. They found Zeshi Zetsume on the training grounds outside the council hall, alone, running drills against a practice dummy with the same fierce, restless intensity that had made her the theocracy's most formidable living warrior, even before the war's end. One of the few scripture bearers who had survived the conflict with the Sorcerer's kingdom largely intact, and who had, in the years since, grown visibly disillusioned with a council she no longer fully trusted to deserve her sword. She stopped mid-strike the moment she registered Beerus's presence, weapon lowering with the wary, professional caution of a warrior who understood immediately, on some instinctive level, that she had just encountered something her considerable strength could not meaningfully measure. "You're the one everyone's been whispering about," she said, studying him with open, unafraid curiosity, rather than the fear Raymond's counsel had shown. "The god who's been touring the continent, judging kingdoms like a merchant, inspecting produce." Beerus's ears flicked with something like genuine amusement at the description. "That's not far off, actually," he said. "What do you think of your own theocracy, warrior? Not the official line. What you actually think." Zeshi considered the question with the same blunt, unhurried honesty she brought to everything, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of one hand. "I think it stopped deserving my sword somewhere around the 3rd year after the war ended, when the council chose grudge-holding over rebuilding," she said. "I think most of the people still fighting for it don't fight for the theocracy anymore. They fight for the memory of what it used to be, before it lost. And I think," she added, meeting his gaze with a directness that clearly startled even Beerus slightly, "that I've been trying to decide for a long time now whether that's a reason to leave, or a reason to stay and try to drag it back towards something worth fighting for. I haven't decided yet." Beerus studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression, the same grudging respect he'd shown Demiurge, shown Jerkniv, shown the priest Nicholas, settled into place. "Keep not deciding for a while longer," he said finally. "The ones who stay to fight for what something could be, instead of what it already is, those are usually the ones worth watching. I'll be curious to see which way you land, warrior." He turned to Ainz. The earlier cold judgment in his bearing softened, though not fully dispelled by the conversation. "Your alliance has a rotting limb," Beerus said flatly. "The theocracy's leadership is closer to curdled than anything else I've seen in this world so far. Whether the whole thing goes with it, or whether people like her." A nod toward Zeshi. "And that priest in the lower quarter managed to save something worth saving. I genuinely don't know yet. That's the honest answer, Skeleton King. I don't have a verdict for you. Not yet." "What would change that?" Ainz asked quietly. Beerus's golden eyes turned toward the horizon, toward the vast, unseen shape of the continent's remaining unknowns, the 8 Fingers criminal underworld, the demi-human tribes at the world's edges, the deeper currents of the Sorceress Kingdom's own internal politics that Ainz had not yet shown him. "There's more of your world I haven't seen," Beerus said. "The parts you'd rather I didn't look at too closely, if I had to guess. Show me those next, Skeleton King. Because a kingdom's true shape isn't found in its throne rooms, or its allies' council halls. It's found in the corners it hopes no one bothers to check." The 8 Fingers did not have a throne room, a council chamber, or any single visible seat of power, which was, Ainz reflected as he led Beerus and Whis through the winding, lamplit undercity beneath Erantel's southern district, rather the point. Nazarick had absorbed the criminal organization's upper leadership years ago, folding its slaving operations and black market trade into something more useful and considerably more controlled. But the deeper currents of the 8 Fingers' old culture, the smugglers, the information brokers, the quietly desperate networks that had always operated in the spaces polite society preferred not to examine, had proven far harder to fully absorb than any military campaign. They persisted, adapted, and in their own way, thrived in the gaps between what Nazarick chose to see and what it chose to overlook. "You've been avoiding this part of your kingdom," Beerus observed, as they descended a narrow stone stairway into a district lit by cheap alchemical lamps rather than the clean magical illumination that governed the city above. "I noticed it back at the throne room. Every time someone mentioned this quarter, your guardians got very careful about how they phrased things." "Nazarick oversees it," Ainz said. choosing his words with the same care Beerus had just identified. We do not control every transaction that occurs within it. There is a difference, and I have found it useful, in governing a kingdom this large, not to pretend the difference away. Useful for you, Beerus said, or useful for the people still trapped in whatever's left of the old slaving networks you supposedly absorbed. Ainz did not answer immediately, and the silence itself was, he understood with some discomfort, its own kind of answer. They found the woman they were looking for in a cramped tavern back room that smelled of cheap wine and older, staler secrets. A broker known in the Undercity only as Coco Doll, a name Ainz recognized from Nazarick's intelligence reports as one of the few Eight Fingers holdovers who had survived the organization's absorption, not through loyalty to the New Order, but through simple, ruthless usefulness that made her too valuable to eliminate. She did not startle at their arrival the way Raymond's council had. She simply looked up from a ledger of figures Ainz suspected were deliberately incomplete for anyone without proper clearance, assessed the three of them with the flat, professional calculation of a woman who had survived multiple changes of regime by never once betraying surprise, and set down her pen. "The god everyone's talking about," she said, voice carrying the particular gravel of someone who'd spent a long career in rooms like this one, and the Sorcerer King himself, slumming it in my back room. Should I be flattered, or should I be updating my will? "Neither, yet," Beerus said, settling onto an overturned crate with the same unhurried ease he brought to every throne, real or improvised. "Tell me what you actually do down here. Not the sanitized version your king's intelligence reports probably have on file, the real one." Coco studied him for a long moment, weighing. Ainz could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, exactly how much honesty this situation could survive, and arrived, with the pragmatic instinct of a career survivor, at the conclusion that lying to a god currently touring the continent passing judgment on kingdoms was likely the single worst gamble available to her. "I move things the official channels won't touch," she said. "Some of it's the ugly stuff your intelligence reports probably do have flagged. Old slaving contacts who haven't fully given up the trade, just gotten better at hiding it from Nazarick's inspectors. I don't run that anymore, for the record, not since the New Order made the penalties for it considerably more permanent than they used to be. But I know who still does, because knowing is how I stay useful, and staying useful is how I stay alive." She met Beerus's gaze without flinching, something almost defiant in the gesture. "Some of the rest of it is smaller, quieter. Refugees from the old re-estais nobility who can't legally hold property under the New Order moving what wealth they have left through channels that don't ask questions. Demi-human traders who get taxed at the official border crossings in ways that would bankrupt them fair and square, so they find routes that don't." She shrugged, an old, tired gesture. "I'm not going to pretend I'm some noble outlaw, Lord Beerus. I'm not. But I'm also not going to pretend everything that moves through the gaps in this kingdom's control is as ugly as the worst of it. Most of it's just people the New Order's official channels weren't built to accommodate, finding a way to survive anyway." Beerus turned this over for a long moment, tail flicking. "And the slavers," he said. "The ones you say you know about, but don't run yourself. Why haven't you told his intelligence network where to find them?" Something flickered across Coco's face. Not guilt exactly, but the closest thing to it, Ainz suspected she still permitted herself to feel. Because half of them know things about half of Nazarick's absorbed Eight Fingers leadership that would be considerably more embarrassing to surface than the slavers themselves, she said flatly. "Mutual assured destruction, Lord Beerus. It's not noble. It's just how this particular gutter has kept itself from being flooded, for going on 6 years now." Ainz felt the weight of the admission land with the force of a blow he had half expected, and still hadn't fully prepared for. He had known, in the abstract, distant way a ruler knows the uncomfortable edges of his own domain, that Nazarick's absorption of the 8 fingers had never been as clean as his official report suggested. He had not known, had perhaps deliberately avoided knowing, the specific shape of what remained unresolved beneath that absorption. "You're saying," Ainz said slowly, "that corruption within Nazarick's own absorbed leadership is protecting active slaving operations in exchange for silence." "I'm saying exactly that, Your Majesty," Coco said, with a bluntness that carried no particular deference. "And I'm saying it to a god instead of to you directly, because frankly, I trust his judgment on what to do with the information a great deal more than I trust whether telling you directly would just result in the whole mess getting buried deeper, to protect whichever of your guardians turns out to be compromised." The chamber went very quiet. Beerus's golden eyes moved slowly from Coco to Ainz, and something in their weight made clear, without a single word yet spoken, exactly how significant this particular discovery had just become to whatever verdict the god was still assembling. "Names," Beerus said to Coco. "Give me names, not a full confession. I don't need you to solve his kingdom's problems for him. Just enough to know whether this is a wound his own people can still cut out, or whether it's spread too deep to trust the surgery to anyone already standing inside the body." The names Coco gave, delivered over the following hour with the flat, careful precision of a woman protecting her own position even while cooperating, pointed toward a mid-tier administrator within Nazarick's absorbed bureaucracy. Not a floor guardian, not anyone close enough to Ainz's inner circle to constitute the kind of existential betrayal Albedo would have found unbearable, but close enough to the machinery of governance to have quietly redirected inspection schedules, buried certain reports, and accepted payment over a period of years to ensure that a specific network of slavers operating in the kingdom's more remote territories remained comfortably unexamined. Ainz absorbed the information with the particular, cold stillness of a ruler recognizing a genuine failure in his own house, not a dramatic betrayal by someone he loved, which he might have found almost easier to process, but the quieter, more insidious failure of scale, a kingdom grown too large for any single mind, however vast, to personally verify every corner of it, and a corruption that had exploited exactly that blind spot with patient, unglamorous efficiency. "This will be addressed," Ainz said, and there was something in his voice, not the practiced calm of performance, but a genuine, cold resolve that made even Beerus's attention sharpen with interest. "Immediately and thoroughly, not buried, not quietly resolved to protect Nazarick's reputation." He turned to Coco, crimson eyelights steady. "And you will not be punished for what you have told us today, whatever your own history includes. Information given freely, at genuine risk to yourself, in service of correcting a wrong within my own kingdom. That is not something I intend to answer with cruelty." Coco studied him for a long moment, and something in her flat, professional composure shifted. Not warmth, not trust, not yet, but the faint, grudging recalibration of a woman revising a long-held assumption about the nature of the king who ruled over her. "Careful, Your Majesty," she said, with the ghost of something almost like a smile. "Word gets around fast in the gutters. Be merciful to one informant, and you'll have half the Undercity lined up at your throne room door within the week. Then perhaps," Ainz said, and Ainz himself seemed faintly surprised by his own words even as he spoke them, "that would not be the worst outcome available to this kingdom." Beerus, watching the exchange with an unreadable expression, rose from his crate at last, tail curling with something that might, in a being of his composure, have been the closest thing to satisfaction he permitted himself to show. "There it is," he said, to no one in particular, though his gaze rested on Ainz with renewed, genuine interest. "That's the thing I came here to find out, Skeleton King. Not whether your kingdom is perfect. Nothing is. And I stopped expecting perfection from mortal empires a very long time ago. What matters is whether it corrects itself when it finds the rot, or whether it just learns to live comfortably alongside it. He turned toward the stairway leading back up into Irantel's cleaner upper streets. The conversation, for now, apparently concluded. You've got a wound to cut out, Ainz Ooal Gown. I'll be watching to see whether you actually do it, or whether today was just a very convincing performance for an audience of one. The compromised administrator was arrested within the day. The slaving network he had protected dismantled within the week, under Sebastian's own direct, methodical oversight, a task Ainz had assigned deliberately to the one guardian, whose moral clarity he trusted absolutely not to let the matter quietly disappear into bureaucratic convenience. But the deeper unease the discovery had planted did not dismantle so easily. Ainz found himself, in the days that followed, turning the incident over again and again in the private, unblinking dark of his own thoughts. How many other blind spots existed within a kingdom too vast for any single mind to fully see? How much of his careful, controlled order was, in truth, only as clean as the last corner someone had bothered to check? It was Demiurge who found him in the throne room's private study late one night, still turning the question over. "You are troubled, Supreme One," Demiurge observed, with the careful, respectful distance of a guardian who understood exactly when to press and when to simply be present. "I built Nazarick's order on the premise of control," Ainz said quietly. "Total, verified, absolute control. The only kind of safety I trusted, after losing everything I had before. And in 6 years of governing this kingdom, I did not know about a slaving network operating comfortably beneath my own absorbed bureaucracy, protected by a man I had never once personally reviewed, because my attention was always fixed on the threats large enough to demand it." He looked up, crimson eyelights carrying something that, in a living face, might have been genuine grief. "Beerus is not testing whether I am powerful enough to survive him, Demiurge. He never was. He is testing whether the thing I built is honest enough to deserve surviving. And I am no longer certain I know the full answer to that question myself." Demiurge was quiet for a moment, considering his next words with the same careful precision he had used in that first field with Beerus, days ago. "Then perhaps, Supreme One," he said finally, "the answer is not something you can know in advance. Perhaps it is something you can only keep choosing, correction by correction, wound by wound cut out honestly, instead of hidden, and trust that a God who values honesty over performance will recognize the difference between a kingdom pretending to be good and a kingdom actually trying to become it." Ainz said nothing for a long while, the study's candlelight flickering against obsidian walls, the weight of an unfinished judgment still hanging, patient and unresolved, somewhere over the whole of his kingdom. "I hope you're right," he said finally, "because I do not think this God intends to give us very much more time to prove it." The summons that shattered the fragile, cautious rhythm Ainz had begun to establish with Beerus arrived 4 days later, and it did not come from Beerus at all. It came from the slain theocracy. Demiurge brought the report to the throne room himself, his usual theatrical calm stripped down to something leaner and more urgent, and Ainz felt the particular vertigo of a man watching a carefully balanced structure begin to tilt before he had even finished reading the first line. Cardinal Raymond's council, or more precisely, the zealot faction within it that Raymond had admitted, in that raw, unguarded moment before Beerus, had never fully abandoned the dream of reversing the theocracy's defeat, had not waited to see how the gods' judgment eventually fell. They had acted first, and they had acted with a recklessness that suggested men who understood, on some desperate level, that their moment to matter was closing. "They've moved against Zeshi Zetsume," Demiurge said. branded her a traitor to the faith for the words she spoke in Lord Beerus's presence, sympathizing, as their proclamation frames it, with the undead occupation instead of the theocracy's righteous cause. They've stripped her of her scripture status and dispatched a faction of the remaining loyalist scripture-bearers to detain her. And, he paused, choosing the next words with visible care, they have also begun quietly mobilizing what remains of the theocracy's military reserves along the Holy Kingdom's border. Not a declaration of war, Supreme One. Not yet. But a shape that could become one, very quickly, if no one intervenes. They're gambling, Ainz said slowly, working through the strategic shape of it with the old, familiar machinery of calculation that had, for a few days, been quieted by something closer to genuine soul-searching. If Beerus's judgment is going to fall against them regardless, a desperate faction might reason that provoking a war now, while attention is divided, gives them a chance to seize something. Territory, leverage, a fait accompli, before the verdict lands and strips away whatever power they still hold to act at all. And Zeshi Zetsume, Albedo added, her voice carrying a rare note of genuine concern beneath its usual composed devotion, was the one figure in that council who showed Lord Beerus something worth respecting. If the Zealot faction destroys her specifically for that honesty, they will be answering Beerus's entire judgment with the exact rot he already suspected, Ainz finished, and felt the cold clarity of the realization settle over him like a physical weight. This is not merely a crisis for the theocracy. This is the moment his verdict on this entire continent may be decided. And I do not know if there is a version of this where Nazarick can intervene without appearing to have orchestrated it, without confirming every fear that God has ever had about kingdoms that use crisis as an excuse for control. Wiss's voice, mild and unbothered, drifted from the study's doorway before anyone had noticed his and Beerus's arrival. As it happens, Wiss said, Lord Beerus has already noticed. Beerus stood beside him, and the lazy, unhurried curiosity that had characterized every interaction across the past week was entirely gone from his bearing now, replaced by something colder, more focused. The stillness, Ainz understood with a fresh surge of dread, of a judge who had just watched the defendant confirm the prosecution's worst argument in real time. I felt it the moment they moved against her, Beerus said. The same wrongness I felt the day I first woke up in this world, except this time it's not old and buried, it's fresh, and it's happening right now. And it's happening specifically because a handful of frightened, prideful men decided punishing honesty was easier than reckoning with what the honesty cost them to hear. His golden eyes fixed on Ainz with an intensity that made the whole throne room feel suddenly, dangerously small. Here is your test, Skeleton King. Not a conversation this time. Not a tour. A faction of your world's worst rot is about to hurt one of the few honest things I found in it, and I want to see, in real time, what a kingdom that claims to correct itself when it finds the wound actually does when the wound is bleeding right now. Ainz rose from his throne, every strategic instinct he possessed screaming at once. The danger of appearing to seize theocracy territory under cover of crisis, the danger of moving too slowly and losing Zeshi to a faction that had already shown its willingness toward cruelty, the danger, above and beneath every other calculation, of failing this specific test in front of the one being whose judgment could unmake everything he had built without so much as raising his voice. Albedo, Shaltir, mobilize a rapid response force, but hold it at the border, visible but not crossing, until I give explicit order, Ainz said, the old, familiar calm of command settling back over him, even as the ground beneath every plan felt thinner than it ever had before. Demiurge, Cocytus, with me. We go to Zeshi directly, not to conquer, not to occupy, to intervene in a single, specific act of cruelty, and nothing more. Because if we arrive looking like an invasion, we will have proven every fear this god has ever had about us correct, whatever our actual intentions. And if the zealot faction resists the intervention? Cocytus asked, forearms already shifting toward readiness. Ainz's crimson eyelights hardened. Then we will learn, in front of the one judge whose verdict actually matters right now, whether Nazarick can use its strength to protect something honest, without letting that strength curdle into exactly the conquest this god has spent a week deciding whether to fear from us. They arrived at the theocracy's border garrison, a modest fortification near the Holy Kingdom line, repurposed in the years since the war as a staging ground for the zealot faction's quiet remobilization, to find the situation already deteriorating. Zeshi Zetsume, stripped of her scripture rank but very much not stripped of her considerable combat ability, had refused detention, and what had begun as an arrest was rapidly curdling into an open, bloody confrontation between her and 6 loyalist scripture-bearers dispatched to bring her in by force. She was good, better than 6 ordinary warriors should have been able to meaningfully threaten, but 6 against 1, even against a warrior of Zeshi's caliber, was a math that eventually resolved in the numbers' favor, and Ainz arrived at the garrison's outer courtyard to find her bleeding from 3 separate wounds, one arm hanging useless at her side, still fighting with the same fierce, stubborn defiance that had made Beerus notice her in the first place. "Stand down," Ainz commanded, and his voice, amplified through magic honed across years of battlefield command, cracked across the courtyard with enough force to freeze every combatant mid-motion. "This engagement ends now, by order of the Sorcerer King." The scripture-bearers hesitated, caught between the standing orders of a council faction desperate enough to have gambled everything on this moment, and the very real, very immediate presence of the single most powerful ruler on the continent, standing in their courtyard with 2 floor guardians at his back. It was, Ainz understood in the taut, dangerous silence that followed, exactly the kind of moment that could tip either toward de-escalation or toward a catastrophe neither side could fully control. It was Cardinal Raymond himself who arrived a moment later, breathless from a hard ride, having clearly rushed to the border the instant word reached him that his zealot faction's gambit had spiraled beyond anyone's ability to quietly contain. And Ainz watched, with something that was not quite relief and not quite renewed hope, as the Cardinal's face, upon taking in the full scene, crumpled into something that looked, for the first time since their first meeting, genuinely and completely human. "Stand down," Raymond echoed, his voice raw. "All of you. This was never sanctioned by the full council. This was Varick's faction acting alone, and it ends now, before it becomes something none of us can undo." He turned to Ainz, and something in his bearing, the brittle hostility Ainz had first encountered days ago, had cracked entirely open, revealing beneath it a man exhausted by years of grievance he no longer had the strength to keep carrying. "I am sorry, Sorcerer King. I should have moved against Varick's faction the moment I understood how far their desperation had grown. I told myself I was preserving unity within the council. I was, in truth, avoiding a fight I did not want to have with men I had once called brothers in faith." Zeshi, still bleeding, still upright through sheer stubborn will, looked between the Cardinal and the King with an expression caught somewhere between exhausted disbelief and something that might, cautiously, have been the first flicker of real hope she had allowed herself in years. Above the courtyard, unseen by any but those who knew to look, Beerus watched the entire scene unfold from where he floated, motionless, in the pale afternoon sky, golden eyes taking in every detail, the restraint Ainz had shown in not simply crushing the situation with overwhelming force, the genuine grief in Raymond's belated intervention, the wounded, defiant honesty of a warrior who had refused to be silenced for speaking a hard truth. He said nothing yet, but something in the god's expression, watching from above, had shifted. The cold, judging stillness of the past hour giving way, fractionally, to something that might, in time, resolve into the verdict every faction on the continent now held its breath to learn. The garrison courtyard held its breath as Beerus descended, slow and unhurried, the golden light of late afternoon catching against his violet fur as his feet touched the blood-stained stones. Every combatant present, the 6 scripture-bearers still frozen mid-retreat, Cardinal Raymond, his composure in ruins, Zeshi, swaying on her feet but refusing to fall, Ainz and his 2 guardians, watchful and tense, turned toward him with the particular stillness of people awaiting a verdict they understood, on some instinctive level, would not be subject to appeal. Beerus walked first to Zeshi, ignoring everyone else in the courtyard entirely, and studied her wounds with an expression that carried none of his usual boredom. "You could have surrendered," he said. 6 against 1. You knew the math wasn't in your favor. "I know," Zeshi said, through gritted teeth, refusing, even now, even bleeding, to let the pain fully into her voice. "I decided a long time ago that I'd rather lose fighting for what I actually believe than survive by pretending I believe something else. Doesn't much matter to me whether that's a fight against Nazarick or a fight against my own council, if the cause is the same either way." Beerus's expression, for the first time since the confrontation began, softened into something almost gentle, a strange, incongruous tenderness on a face built primarily for judgment and appetite. He reached out, and with a small, negligent gesture, the worst of her wounds simply closed, flesh knitting seamlessly back together in a way that owed nothing to any healing magic the New World's tiered systems could produce. "Don't get used to that," Beerus said gruffly, already turning away as if embarrassed by his own generosity. "I don't do that for everyone." He turned next to Raymond, and the warmth vanished from his bearing, as completely as it had arrived. "You knew this faction was building toward something," Beerus said. "You told me yourself, days ago, that you hadn't disagreed with them as strongly as you should have. And now 6 of your warriors nearly killed the one honest voice left in your entire council, because you were more comfortable avoiding the confrontation than having it." Raymond did not attempt to defend himself. "Yes," he said simply, "that is true. I have no excuse that would not sound, to you, like exactly the kind of comfortable lie you have spent this past week teaching me to recognize in myself." Something in the plain, unflinching admission seemed to land with Beerus more forcefully than any elaborate defense could have. He studied the cardinal for a long moment, tail flicking slowly, weighing something Ainz could not fully follow. "You came," Beerus said finally. "The moment you understood what your avoidance had cost, you rode out here yourself, and you stopped it before it became something worse. That's not nothing, Cardinal. It's not enough, not yet. You have a faction inside your own council that needs to be dealt with, honestly and completely, not managed around for another 6 years. But it's not nothing." He turned to survey the whole courtyard. Ainz, the guardians, the frozen scripture bearers, the wounded warrior now standing straighter with her wounds closed. "Here is what I've decided, since apparently everyone here has been waiting to hear it." The courtyard went utterly silent. "This world isn't curdled," Beerus said. "I want to be clear about that, because I know every one of you has spent the last week wondering whether I was about to erase everything you've built. I'm not. I've seen enough honesty in enough corners of this continent. A devil who negotiates instead of destroys. An emperor who's defusing a bomb instead of demolishing a building. A smuggler who gave up names at genuine risk to herself. A priest who fed his people before worrying about his own fate. A warrior who'd rather lose honestly than win as a lie. and a king who owned every failure I put in front of him instead of hiding from it. His golden eyes settled on Ainz, and something in them carried real weight now, the full accumulated judgment of a week's careful observation. That's more honesty than I find in most worlds I visit, Skeleton King. Most civilizations I've erased didn't have a fraction of that. Ainz felt something in his chest, hollow, undead, and yet, in this moment, more vividly alive than it had felt in years, loosen with a relief so total, it was almost disorienting. But, Beerus continued, and the word landed like a blade, I also found real rot. A council faction willing to nearly kill an honest woman rather than face a hard truth. A kingdom's absorbed bureaucracy quietly protecting slavers for years because no one with the power to stop it was looking closely enough. Grievances curdling into wars nobody's willing to actually end. That rot doesn't get to just continue unaddressed because the rest of the picture looked good enough to earn my patience. He looked back to Ainz, golden eyes hard. So here is my judgment, and it is not the ending you were hoping for, because I don't think this story is finished yet. I am not erasing your world, Ainz Ooal Gown, but I am not leaving either. I intend to keep watching, closer than before, now that I know exactly which corners still need watching, and the next time I find something curdled that no one bothered to cut out, I will not be nearly as patient as I have been this week. The days that followed carried a strange, unsteady quality across the continent, the particular hush of a world that had been examined by something vastly beyond its own scale, and had, against every reasonable expectation, been permitted to continue existing, while understanding, in the same breath, that the examination was not truly finished. Word of Beerus's verdict spread with predictable speed through every faction that had crossed his path, and predictable variety in how it was received. Cardinal Raymond, in the weeks that followed, moved against the zealot faction within his own council with a thoroughness that surprised even Zeshi. Varick and his co-conspirators formally stripped of rank and authority. A slow, painful, genuinely honest reckoning begun within the theocracy's leadership, for the first time since the war's end. It was not complete. It would not be complete for years. But it was, Zeshi admitted privately to Demiurge during a diplomatic visit some weeks later. The first time in 6 years, I've believed the council actually meant what it said, instead of just managing the appearance of meaning it. Emperor Jirkniv, informed of the verdict through Nazarick's diplomatic channels, responded with characteristic pragmatism, accelerating, quietly but genuinely, several of the gladiatorial reforms he had previously been navigating with slow caution, a decision he attributed publicly to internal policy review, and privately, in a letter to Ainz that arrived some days later, to a reasonable desire not to be the next kingdom that God decides has run out of patience for. Coco Doll disappeared from her usual haunts within the week, resurfacing, according to Sebas's careful intelligence gathering, in a new, quieter role within a legitimate merchant guild. The Sorceress Kingdom's reformed bureaucracy had begun cultivating specifically to draw the Undercity's informal economy into something closer to accountability. Whether this represented genuine reform or simply a smarter survival strategy, Ainz found himself unable to fully determine, and decided, after some consideration, that the distinction perhaps mattered less than the outcome. And within Nazarick itself, the mid-tier corruption Coco had exposed proved, in the weeks of careful investigation that followed under Sebas's direct oversight, to run somewhat deeper than the single administrator initially identified. A discovery that cost Ainz several more sleepless nights of the particular, undead immune to sleep variety, but which he pursued to its full extent regardless, driven now by something that had stopped being purely strategic calculation and had become, in some way he did not fully examine, a genuine reckoning with what kind of king he actually wanted to be. verdict or no verdict. It was Albedo who found him on the throne room's balcony, some weeks after the confrontation at the border garrison, staring out at the lights of Rantel spread below in the deep blue hush of evening. "You are still troubled, my lord," she observed, settling beside him with the easy, devoted familiarity of a guardian who had earned the right to speak plainly in his private moments. Even now, with his verdict rendered and Nazarick still standing, he did not render a final verdict, Albedo, Ainz said quietly. He rendered a stay of judgment. There is a considerable difference, and I do not think he intends for either of us to forget it. He turned his crimson gaze toward her, and something in it carried a weight she had rarely seen there before. Not the calculated performance of confidence he wore for his guardians, but something rawer and more honest. I have spent 6 years believing that control was the same thing as safety, that if I built my kingdom carefully enough, verified enough, guarded enough, nothing could ever again take from me what this world already once took. Beerus's presence has taught me something I am not certain I wanted to learn, that no amount of control protects against the parts of my own kingdom I refuse to look at closely enough. The slavers were not stopped by my strategy, Albedo. They were stopped because a smuggler chose honesty over self-preservation, in front of a being who valued that honesty more than any power I could have deployed against the problem myself. Albedo was quiet for a moment, considering this with the same careful devotion she brought to every problem Ainz set before her. "Then perhaps," she said finally, "the lesson is not that control failed you, my lord. Perhaps it is that control was never meant to be the whole of what you built. You have guardians who love you. A kingdom slowly learning, however imperfectly, to trust itself. A God who found enough honesty in what you've made to grant it more time, rather than erasing it outright. Perhaps that is not a smaller victory than the one you were originally trying to build. Perhaps it is simply a truer one." Ainz said nothing for a long while. The lights of his kingdom spread below them in the gathering dark, and somewhere beyond the horizon, in a clearing, or a mountain peak, or some corner of the continent Ainz had not yet learned to fully anticipate, a God who had chosen not to erase them, slept, or watched, or waited, with all the patience of a being who had all the time that existed, and had decided for now that this particular corner of it was still worth the effort of watching closely. "I hope you're right, Albedo," Ainz said finally, "because something tells me the true test of what we've built has not yet arrived, and when it does, I do not think our God of destruction will be the only power watching to see how we answer it." Far to the south, in a mountain range long abandoned by the maps of every kingdom on the continent, something else had begun, in recent weeks, to stir. A presence far older than Beerus's arrival, disturbed not by the God of destruction's judgment, but by the ripples that judgment had sent through the deep, ancient currents of the world's own buried magic. Currents that had lain dormant since long before Nazarick ever descended into this world at all. It did not yet have a name that mattered to the story unfolding in Rantel's throne room, but it had noticed the disturbance, and it had begun, with a patience of its own that made even Beerus's unhurried attention look almost hasty by comparison, to consider whether the new world's newest guest deserved a welcome of a very different kind. The mountain range had a name once, in a language none of the new world's current kingdoms still spoke fluently. The old dwarven chronicles called it the Drowned Spine, for reasons lost even to most dwarven scholars, and the demi-human tribes who still eked out a wary existence along its lower slopes avoided its higher peaks by ancient, unquestioned custom. Nazarick's own extensive intelligence network had catalogued the region only cursorily, flagging it as strategically irrelevant. No settlements worth the resources to monitor, no resources worth the cost of extraction, nothing but old stone and older silence. They had been wrong, and Demiurge was the first to understand exactly how wrong, when the reports began arriving 3 weeks after the border garrison's crisis. A scouting patrol vanished without trace along the range's eastern approach. A dwarven trading caravan returned to its home settlement with every member describing, independently and with identical, disturbing specificity, dreams of a voice speaking a language that predated their own oldest chronicles. And, most alarmingly, a low, resonant tremor detected by Nazarick's deep earth wards, the same category of sensor that had first flagged Beerus's arrival, though the reading this time carried a different, older quality, less an absence shaped like a presence, and more a presence that had simply been asleep for a very long time, and was now, slowly and deliberately, beginning to stir. Ainz received the report in the throne room with a specific, weary dread that had become familiar over the past month. The particular exhaustion of a ruler who had barely finished absorbing one existential test, only to find a second one assembling itself on the horizon, before the first had fully resolved. The evil deities, Demiurge said, once the assembled guardians had reviewed the full pattern of anomalies. It is the only category of threat in this world's own ancient history that matches the signature. Beings sealed away in the earliest ages of this world's recorded history, powerful enough that even the gods of that era judged them too dangerous to leave unbound. The chronicles are fragmentary. Most modern scholars treat them as allegory, the way they once treated the 6 great gods' own war against them as myth rather than history. And now something in those mountains is waking, Shaltir said, her usual restless hunger for battle tempered, this time, by genuine unease. Waking, specifically, in the weeks since Lord Beerus's judgment sent whatever ripples it sent through this world's older currents. Ainz turned this over with the same careful, methodical dread he had learned to apply to every crisis since Beerus's arrival, searching, out of long habit, for the strategic shape of the threat, the angle from which it could be understood, contained, countered. But something in Demiurge's report nagged at him more insistently than the raw danger alone accounted for, and it took him a long moment to place exactly what it was. If this is an evil deity, Ainz said slowly, sealed by the gods of this world's earliest age, gods this world's own oldest chronicles suggest were considerably weaker, in raw scale, than what we now understand Beerus to be, then its waking is not merely a threat to the Sorcerer's kingdom. It may be a threat that draws Beerus's attention directly. And I do not yet know, he continued, the weight of the realization settling over the throne room like a held breath. Whether that would help us, or whether it would simply mean that whatever we now face, we face in the middle of 2 forces vastly beyond our own scale colliding, with our entire kingdom caught in whatever ground lies between them. Beerus, as it happened, had already noticed. He and Weiss had made a habit, in the weeks since the border garrison, of drifting through the continent at their own unhurried pace, not actively watching Nazarick with the intensity of the first days, but present in a looser, more ambient sense, the way a landlord might periodically walk past a tenant's door without necessarily intending to knock. It was during one such idle drift, high above the drowned spine's jagged peaks, that Beerus's ears had first flattened, his tail gone rigid with an alertness Weiss had not seen from him since the earliest hours of their arrival in this world. "That's old," Beerus said, staring down at the mountain range with an expression that mingled genuine surprise with something colder and more assessing. "Older than anything I've felt since we got here. Older than the necromantic rot that woke me up in the first place. An older power than Nazarick's own," Weiss observed, studying the range with the same mild, unbothered interest he brought to everything, though something in his posture had sharpened as well. "How intriguing. Do you recognize the signature, my lord?" Beerus was quiet for a long moment, tail flicking with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a predator recalculating a hunt mid-stride. "Not specifically," he admitted, "but I recognize the shape of it. I've felt things like this before, In other universes, old powers, sealed away by gods who thought they'd found a clever enough cage, waking up centuries or millennia later because the seal finally wore thin, or because something in the world's balance shifted enough to loosen it. His golden eyes narrowed, fixed on the mountain's highest peak, where something ancient and patient was, even now, drawing slow, deliberate breath after eons of dormancy. I might have loosened it myself, without meaning to. My arrival, this world's own reaction to it, the ripples that sent through whatever old magic this place is built on, that's exactly the kind of disturbance that wakes something like this early. Does that trouble you? Whis asked, mild as ever, though the question carried real weight beneath its casual delivery. Beerus considered this with unusual seriousness, and when he answered, something in his voice carried a note Whis rarely heard from his student. Not quite guilt. Beerus was not built for guilt in any conventional sense, but something adjacent to it, a god's rare acknowledgement that his own presence had consequences reaching beyond his immediate intent. A little, Beerus admitted. I came here to judge whether this world deserved to keep existing. I didn't come here to wake up something that might unmake it before I've even finished deciding. He rose from his cross-legged perch on empty air, the lazy, unhurried quality of his usual movement, replaced by something sharper, more purposeful. Let's go meet it properly, before it decides to introduce itself to the Skeleton King's kingdom the hard way. I'd rather handle this one myself than watch his mortal armies get ground up trying. What woke, in the deep stone heart of the drowned spine's highest peak, called itself, in the ancient fragmented tongue that predated every current language on the continent, a name that translated, roughly and imperfectly, across the intervening ages, to something like the Herald of the Waning, one of the lesser evil deities from the world's earliest recorded age, bound not by death but by a seal woven from the combined power of gods who no longer walked the world, left dormant beneath the mountain for longer than any current civilization's written history extended. It emerged not as a single form but as a slow, spreading corruption, the mountain stone cracking and blackening in a widening radius from its peak, the demi-human tribes on the lower slopes fleeing in the night as their oldest ancestral warnings finally proved themselves true, and the air itself, for leagues in every direction, taking on the specific, wrong quality of a held breath that refuses to release. Nazarick's deep earth wards, already strained by the anomaly's growing intensity, began registering a mana signature that, while nowhere near the category-defying absence Beerus's own presence had first produced, was nonetheless larger and more actively hostile than anything Nazarick's forces had directly confronted since the war against the slain theocracy. Ainz mobilized a defensive perimeter along the mountain's lower approaches within the day. Shaltir and Cocytus, dispatched with a significant portion of Nazarick's most capable forces, under strict orders to hold position and observe rather than engage. A caution born, this time, not merely of strategic prudence, but of the hard-won understanding, forged across the past month, that some threats could not be measured by any framework Nazarick's own considerable power was built to assess. It was Cocytus who first spotted Beerus and Whis descending toward the mountain's corrupted peak, and the four-armed guardian felt, watching the god of destruction approach an ancient evil, with the same unhurried, almost bored confidence he'd shown from the very first day of his arrival, a strange and unexpected surge of something that was not quite relief. The Supreme One was right to be cautious, Cocytus reported back through the coordinated mind link Nazarick's forces maintained across the perimeter. This one is beyond what our forces alone should engage directly, but it appears we will not need to. Above the mountain, in the gathering dark of a sky gone thick with the corrupted air's ambient wrongness, Beerus regarded the spreading blackness with the same flat, assessing patience he had once turned on a bandit leader in a small, unremarkable village. and on Cardinal Raymond's brittle grievance, and on every corner of this world he had spent the past month carefully weighing. "I don't know what you are," Beerus said, "to the mountain, to the spreading corruption, to whatever ancient and patient malice was gathering itself within the stone, and I don't especially care what grudge you're carrying from whatever age of this world first thought it clever to lock you away instead of finishing the job properly. But you picked a very inconvenient century to wake up in, because I am currently in the middle of deciding whether this world deserves to keep existing, and I do not appreciate distractions." The mountain's peak split fully open, and something vast, ancient, and hungry began, at last, to unfold itself into the world it had been denied for more ages than any current chronicle could accurately count. What emerged from the drowned spine's shattered peak did not resemble anything in the new world's current bestiaries, and Cocytus, who had catalogued, across his considerable existence, every manner of monstrous form Nazarick's own dungeons contained, found himself, watching from the perimeter through the mind-link's shared sight, momentarily unable to fully process the shape unfolding above the mountain. It was vast in the way a held breath is vast, not a single coherent body so much as a slow, continuous unfolding of wrongness, black stone, and older darkness knitted together into something that suggested, without ever quite committing to, the rough silhouette of a many-limbed, many-eyed god, from an age when gods had not yet learned restraint. Where it moved, the mountain's remaining stone did not merely crack but seemed to forget, briefly and locally, that it had ever been stone at all, reality itself growing thin and uncertain in its wake. The air for leagues around carried the specific taste of old blood and older hunger, and the demi-human tribes who had fled the lower slopes in the night felt, even from many miles distant, an ancestral dread their oldest chronicles had tried, imperfectly, to prepare them for across 10,000 years of careful, unbroken warning. "Young thing," the herald of the waning said, its voice arriving not through sound, but through the bones of everyone within a dozen leagues, a vibration that made even Shaltir, who feared very little in this world, grit her teeth against an instinct to flee. "You smell of endings. I have slept through the ending of everything I once knew. Tell me, have you come to grant me a worthier one than the slow rot of this prison?" Beerus, floating unhurried before the vast unfolding horror, with an expression of profound, specific, unimpressed boredom, regarded it for a long moment before answering. "You've been asleep a long time," Beerus said. "Long enough that you've forgotten how conversations work. I ask the questions here. You answer them." His tail flicked, and something in his golden eyes sharpened into the same cold, assessing focus he'd shown Cardinal Raymond's counsel, though scaled now to a subject that could, in theory if not in practice, actually challenge him. "What were you sealed for?" Not the vague poetic version, the actual crime. The herald's vast, half-formed shape rippled, something that might, on a being of its scale, have passed for genuine consideration. "I devoured. That was my nature. In the age before this one's gods learned to fear me, I devoured kingdoms, and the souls within them, and the memory of their having existed at all, not because I hated them, but because hunger does not require hatred to be satisfied. The gods of that age called it evil. I called it simply what I was. Hunger without judgment," Beerus said slowly, and something in his voice carried a note of genuine, uncomfortable recognition, the specific discomfort of a being confronting a distorted, appetite-driven mirror of his own nature, stripped of every discriminating principle he had spent this entire month applying to the world around him. "I destroy things too, old thing. Don't mistake me for some soft mortal moralist come to lecture you about the sanctity of life. I've unmade more worlds than you devoured kingdoms, probably, across my own long existence. But I don't destroy indiscriminately. I look first. I decide whether a thing has earned its ending, or whether it's still worth the space it occupies. That's the entire difference between what I am and what you are, and it is not a small difference, whatever you'd like to tell yourself in that ancient, hungry dark you crawled out of. A god who judges before he devours, the herald said, something that might have been amusement, vast, ancient, and utterly without warmth, rippling through its half-formed mass. How tedious, how modern. Very well, young thing. Judge me, then, if your restraint requires the formality. I have slept long enough to no longer care which answer you arrive at, so long as this prison of stone and silence finally ends. Beerus was quiet for a moment, weighing something in the vast, patient stillness that had characterized every judgment he'd rendered across this entire month-long stay in the New World. And when he answered, his voice carried none of the careful, curious weighing he'd shown Ainz, or Jerkniv, or even Cardinal Raymond in his worst moment. No, Beerus said simply. I don't need to weigh this one. You told me yourself. You don't hate, you don't choose, you don't discriminate between a tyrant's kingdom and a fishing village's. You just consume, because consuming is all you know how to be. That's not a civilization with a rotten corner worth cutting out. That's not even a being making bad choices I might respect the honesty of. That's just an appetite wearing the shape of a god, and I have never once, in any universe, found a reason to let an appetite like that keep existing once it's woken up hungry. He raised one hand, unhurried, violet-white energy gathering at his fingertips, with the same casual, absolute confidence he had shown erasing a nameless bandit in a nameless village weeks before, except scaled now, visibly, to something that made even the distant guardians watching through the mind link feel the air itself grow thin with anticipation. Then finish it, the herald said, and for the first time, something that might have been genuine relief threaded through its vast, ancient voice. I have waited long enough. Not yet, Beerus said. You don't get an easy ending. You devoured kingdoms without ever once looking at what you were taking. I'm going to make sure, before this is over, that you understand exactly what you're losing. Every soul, every memory, every small and specific thing you erased, without ever bothering to notice, it mattered. That's the difference between my ending and the one you were hoping for. Mine actually cost something. What followed was not, by any measure the New World's own chronicles would ever be equipped to fully record, a battle in any conventional sense. Cocytus, watching through the mind link with the rest of Nazarick's perimeter forces, would later struggle to describe it even to Ainz directly. Not a clash of weapons or spells, but something closer to a vast, silent, unmaking, violet-white light, spreading through the herald's ancient darkness, the way dawn spreads through a long night. Patient and absolute and utterly without mercy, while the mountain itself groaned and settled and, slowly, began to heal the wrongness that had spread from its shattered peak. The herald of the waning did not scream. It had, perhaps, forgotten how. Across 10,000 years of hungry, dreamless sleep, it simply diminished, layer by ancient layer, until the vast, half-formed shape that had unfolded from the mountain's heart was gone entirely, leaving behind only clean stone, clearing air, and a silence that felt, for the first time since Ainz's wards had first detected the disturbance, entirely and simply ordinary. Beerus descended to the perimeter's edge afterward, where Ainz himself had arrived by the time the confrontation concluded, having ridden hard from Rantel the moment Cocytus's report confirmed the scale of the threat unfolding at the world's edge. The god looked, for the first time since his arrival in this world, genuinely tired, not physically, Ainz understood, but in some deeper, more existential register, the specific weariness of a being who had just spent his strength on an ending he found no satisfaction in delivering. That, Beerus said, without preamble, is what actual rot looks like, Skeleton King. Not a corrupt administrator, not a grieving faction that hasn't learned to let go of an old war. That thing back there had no honesty left in it to find, because it never had any honesty in the first place. Nothing but hunger, all the way down, with nothing worth saving underneath it. He turned his golden eyes toward Ainz, and something in them carried a new, sober weight. I want you to understand something, because I think you've spent this past month assuming the real danger was always going to be my judgment of you. It wasn't. Not entirely. Every world I visit has things like that sleeping somewhere in its oldest corners, and my arrival, the disturbance I cause just by existing somewhere I wasn't before, tends to wake them early. That's not your fault, but it is, from here forward, your problem, because I am not going to be the one checking every mountain and every buried seal in this world for the rest of its existence. Ainz absorbed this with the particular cold clarity of a ruler recognizing a threat category he had not previously accounted for in any of his careful, layered contingencies. You're saying there may be more of these, he said, sleeping, waiting for something, your presence, or simply time itself, to loosen whatever seals still hold them. I'm saying, Beerus said, that your world is older and stranger than even you seem to fully understand, Skeleton King, and that surviving my judgment was never going to be the last test this world puts in front of you. It was just the first one loud enough to notice. He looked past Ainz, toward the mountain now settling back into ordinary, ancient stillness, and something almost like grim amusement crossed his weary features. You've survived a god's month-long inspection and an evil deity's 10,000-year hunger in the same season. I'd suggest you use whatever time that buys you wisely, because I have a feeling this world is not finished testing either one of us. The weeks that followed the Herald's ending carried a strange new texture across the continent. Relief, in the immediate aftermath, giving way slowly to something more complicated, as reports began filtering in from Nazarick's expanded intelligence network, now specifically tasked, at Ainz's direct order, with cataloging every rumor of ancient seals, forgotten ruins, and old chronicles too fragmentary for modern scholarship to have taken seriously before. Beerus's warning had planted a seed of genuine systemic unease in Ainz's careful mind, and that unease had, in the weeks since, begun to bear a harvest of uncomfortable discoveries. 3 more sites across the continent flagged as possible dormant seals, 1 confirmed collapsed ward beneath the ruins of an ancient elven settlement, long since reclaimed by forest, and, most troubling of all, a pattern, slowly emerging from the accumulated data, suggesting that whatever seals had once bound this world's oldest dangers were considerably more numerous and considerably more fragile than any current chronicle had ever fully acknowledged. It was against this backdrop of gathering unease that the 8 Fingers' remaining criminal networks, the deeper, more entrenched layer beneath even the corruption Coco Doll had exposed, made their move. Ainz received the report from Sabus late one evening, delivered with the particular grim precision the head butler brought to matters he found genuinely distasteful. A faction within the Undercity's surviving criminal infrastructure, having watched the past month's upheaval, a god's judgment, an ancient horror's waking, a kingdom's attention pulled in every direction at once, had concluded, with the opportunistic calculation of men who had built entire careers on exploiting exactly this kind of distraction, that the moment had arrived to act. Not against Nazarick directly. Even the boldest of the 8 Fingers remnants understood the futility of that. Instead, they had begun quietly reconstituting the old slaving networks Sabus had spent weeks dismantling, this time reaching beyond the kingdom's own borders, into the demi-human tribes still recovering from the Herald's disturbance, communities whose displacement and vulnerability in the crisis's aftermath had made them, in the cold calculation of men without conscience, an easier target than they might otherwise have been. "They are exploiting the exact wound we thought we had closed," Sebas said, his usual measured calm carrying an unmistakable current of genuine anger beneath it. "And they are doing so specifically because they believe our attention is too divided, right now, to notice or respond in time." Ainz felt the old, familiar cold settle over him, not the vertiginous terror Beerus's initial arrival had provoked, but something more grounded and, in its own way, more personally infuriating. The specific fury of a ruler watching the exact failure he had sworn to correct attempt to resurrect itself in a moment of calculated vulnerability. "Find them," Ainz said. "All of them this time. Not merely the visible network, but every root and branch connected to it, however deep it runs into corners we would rather not examine. And Sebas," he paused, weighing the next instruction with unusual care, "I want this handled with absolute thoroughness, but I also want it handled visibly. Beerus is watching how this world corrects its own rot, not merely whether the rot exists. Let this be the answer, delivered plainly, to the question he asked me a month ago in that garrison courtyard." The operation that followed, coordinated across 3 weeks by Sebas's meticulous oversight, and executed with the combined resources of Nazarick's intelligence network and the newly cooperative merchant guild Crocodile, now quietly assisted, dismantled the reconstituted slaving network with a thoroughness that went considerably beyond the earlier, narrower correction, not merely the mid-tier administrator and his immediate circle, but an entire secondary layer of the 8 Fingers' surviving leadership, several corrupt border officials who had accepted bribes to overlook the network's cross-border trafficking, and, in the operation's final and most politically delicate phase, evidence implicating a minor noble house from the old Riestes aristocracy, permitted, under the new order's careful reconciliation policy, to retain limited private wealth in exchange for demonstrated loyalty, who had quietly financed the network's reconstitution in the hope of rebuilding influence lost since the kingdom's fall. It was this final discovery that tested Ainz most directly. House Farmland had, in the 6 years since Riestes's collapse, been held up publicly as a model of the reconciliation policy's success. A former enemy noble house that had, apparently, embraced the new order in good faith, its patriarch a frequent and visible presence at Sorcerer Kingdom's civic functions. His cooperation cited more than once in Ainz's own internal reports, as evidence that his governance could win genuine loyalty, rather than merely enforced compliance. "If we move against House Farmland publicly," Albedo said, in the tense council session convened once Sebas's findings reached the throne room, "it undermines the entire reconciliation policy's credibility. Every other noble house watching will conclude that cooperation earns nothing but eventual suspicion regardless. If we do not move against them," Demiurge countered, "and the truth surfaces regardless, as truths in this particular story seem persistently inclined to do, it will look considerably worse. A kingdom that knew and chose political convenience over justice, in the exact manner the god currently judging us, has spent a month teaching us he finds unforgivable." Ainz sat with the tension for a long moment, the old familiar weight of an impossible choice settling over him with a clarity that felt, in its own strange way, less paralyzing than it once might have. A month of Beerus's patient, unflinching honesty, having worn away some of the old instinct to search for a strategy, clever enough to avoid the cost entirely. "We move against them," Ainz said finally, publicly, thoroughly, and with full transparency about what was found and why, not because it is the strategically comfortable choice. Albedo is right that it carries genuine political cost, but because the reconciliation policy was never meant to be a shield against accountability. If House Fallendel's cooperation was only ever a performance covering continued betrayal, then the policy has already failed in their specific case, and pretending otherwise to protect its broader reputation would be exactly the kind of comfortable lie I have spent this past month learning I can no longer afford to tell myself. The patriarch of House Fallendel was arrested 3 days later, the evidence against him presented publicly and in full, a political cost that rippled, exactly as Albedo had predicted, through the noble houses still navigating their own uneasy accommodation with the new order, several of whom quietly recalculated their own hidden liberties in light of a reconciliation policy that had, apparently, teeth after all. Beerus, who had watched the entire unfolding correction with the same close, unhurried attention he had brought to every test across the past month, found Ainz alone on the throne room balcony, some days after House Fallendel's public reckoning, the gods settling onto the balustrade with the easy, weightless grace that had, by now, become entirely familiar to the kingdom's staff, who had mostly stopped startling at his sudden appearances. "You cost yourself something with that," Beerus observed. "Politically, I could feel the ripple of it through every noble house on this continent, the ones who'd learned to feel comfortable, quietly rebuilding old privileges under cover of good behavior, suddenly, a lot less comfortable." "Yes," Ainz said simply. "Would you have done it a month ago, before I showed up and started asking uncomfortable questions?" Ainz considered this with genuine, unflinching honesty. Another habit, he realized, that a month in this particular god's presence had worn permanently into him. "I do not know," he admitted. "I would like to believe I would have, but I have learned, across this past month, not to fully trust my own certainty about what I would have done in a version of events that did not actually happen. What I know is that I did it this time, with full knowledge of the cost, because the alternative was a comfortable lie I no longer have the stomach for telling myself." He turned to face the god directly. "Is that enough? Is this, the corrections, the accountability, the willingness to pay the cost of it, is this what you have been waiting a month to see?" Beerus was quiet for a long moment, golden eyes fixed on the lights of Erantil spread below, glittering in the deep blue hush of evening. A kingdom that had, in the space of one extraordinary month, weathered a god's judgment, an ancient horror's waking, and its own oldest, ugliest corruption dragged fully into the light and answered honestly, at real and lasting cost. "Close," Beerus said finally. "Closer than I expected, honestly, when I first felt that rot wake me up in my sleep. But I told you once already, Skeleton King, I don't render a verdict on a single good decision, however costly. I render it on the pattern, and there's still one thing I haven't seen from you yet, in this whole long month of watching." "What is that?" Beerus's golden eyes turned toward him, and something in them carried, for the first time, a weight that felt less like judgment and more like genuine, difficult curiosity. The last question. Ainz understood with a slow, dawning unease that the god of destruction had been holding in reserve since the very beginning. "I haven't seen what you do," Beerus said, "when the choice isn't between comfortable and costly. I've seen you pay a real price for honesty, and I respect that more than you probably realize. But every choice you've made this month has still had a right answer underneath it, a clear, honest path, even if it cost you something to walk it. I want to see what you do when there isn't one, when every choice in front of you costs something irreplaceable, and there's no honest path that doesn't leave you responsible for a wound you can't fully close." He rose from the balustrade, tail curling with something that felt, for once, less like idle curiosity and more like genuine, weighted anticipation. "I have a feeling, Skeleton King, that this world is about to hand you exactly that kind of choice. And when it does, that's when I'll finally have my answer." The corruption came slowly at first, and that slowness was, in its own way, the crueler part of it. No dramatic eruption, no clean and singular moment of crisis to rally against, only a spreading wrongness in the soil and water for many leagues around the drowned spine's shattered peak, residue of the herald's ending that Nazarick's own scholars had initially, and wrongly, judged inert. It was not inert, it was patient, in the specific, terrible way that poison is patient, seeping through groundwater, settling into crops, working its slow way into the bodies of anyone who drew sustenance from land the ancient horror's unmaking had touched on its way out of existence. By the time Nazarick's monitoring wards flagged the pattern clearly enough to name it, 2 communities stood squarely within the spreading wrongness's widening reach. A demi-human tribe, beastmen refugees, already displaced once by the herald's initial waking, resettled in what everyone had believed was safe ground further down the mountain slope, and a slain theocracy refugee encampment, and families displaced by years of border conflict and, more recently, by Cardinal Raymond's ongoing internal reckoning with his own zealot faction, who had been granted temporary settlement rights on Sorcerer's Kingdom land as a gesture of the new, uneasy peace between the 2 nations. Both communities had begun, within the same terrible week, to sicken, a wasting corruption that Nazarick's healers, for all their considerable skill, could not fully arrest, only slow, and that would, left unaddressed, kill every member of both settlements within a month. There existed, in Nazarick's treasury, exactly 1 relic capable of a true and total cure, a purification artifact, drawn from the same ancient category of world item as the ring Ainz himself wore, its power vast enough to cleanse the wrongness fully from 1 community's land and people, but only 1. Its single activation drawing so completely on its finite reserve of power that reactivating it for a second target would take, by the most optimistic estimate Nazarick scholars could produce, upward of 6 months to recharge. 6 months neither community afflicted right now actually possessed. Ainz stood in the throne room's private council chamber. The reports from both settlements spread before him, and felt, for the first time since Beerus's arrival, a weight that no amount of careful strategy, no honest accounting of failure, no willingness to pay a political cost could resolve into anything resembling a right answer. "There is no path here that saves both," Demiurge said quietly. The theatrical calm he brought to even the gravest crises stripped down, for once, to something plain and unadorned. "I have run every calculation. Splitting the relic's power would render it insufficient to cure either community fully. A half measure that would slow the corruption in both without curing it in either, buying weeks rather than lives, and possibly costing more lives in the end than committing fully to one choice would." "And accelerated relief efforts?" Ainz asked, though he already suspected, from the flat, careful precision of Demiurge's earlier report, what the answer would be. "Alternative magic, additional resources redirected from elsewhere in the kingdom." "We have exhausted what conventional means can offer," Sebes said, his own composure carrying a visible strain Ainz had rarely seen from the unshakable butler. "The corruption is not a conventional affliction, Supreme One. It responds only to purification of the specific category the relic provides. Every alternative we have attempted has slowed its progress marginally, at best." The chamber fell silent, and Ainz understood, with a clarity that felt almost physically heavy, exactly what he was being asked to decide. Which community? The Beastman tribe, already twice displaced, already carrying the particular vulnerability of a people with no other kingdom to advocate for them, or the theocracy refugees, whose safety on Sorcerer's Kingdom soil represented a fragile, hard-won diplomatic gesture that had cost Cardinal Raymond real political capital to arrange, would live, and which would be permitted, through no fault or failing of their own, to die. There is no honest path through this that does not cost someone everything, Ainz said quietly, more to himself than to the assembled council. Beerus told me this was coming. I did not understand, until this exact moment, what he actually meant. He went to each community himself before deciding, a choice Albedo privately questioned as an unnecessary cruelty to himself, though she did not voice the objection aloud, having learned, across this past month, that her king's need to face the weight of his own decisions directly had become something closer to a moral necessity than a strategic indulgence. The Beastman tribe's elder, a weathered leader named Grash Ironhide, whose people had survived 2 displacements in as many months, met Ainz with a wariness that had, in recent years, softened somewhat toward the undead ruler, who had proven, across the kingdom's uneasy demi-human integration policy, more consistently fair than the human kingdoms that preceded him, though the wariness had not vanished entirely, and Ainz understood exactly why it would not. "You've come to tell us something," Grash said, without preamble, in the flat, exhausted tone of a leader who had learned, through hard experience, that visits from powerful rulers rarely brought good news. "I can see it in how you're standing. Human rulers used to stand like that, right before they told us our grazing rights were being reassigned again. I have come," Ainz said, "because I owe you the truth spoken to your face, not delivered through an intermediary while I remain safely distant from its weight. There is a cure for what afflicts your people. There is also a second community, equally afflicted, and I do not have the means to save both. I have not yet decided, but I did not want you to learn, if the decision falls against your people, that I made it from a throne room without ever once looking you in the eye." Grash was quiet for a long moment, something raw and old moving behind his weathered features. "That's more honesty than any king's ever brought us before a decision like this," he said finally. "Doesn't make it hurt less, if it goes the wrong way. But I won't pretend it means nothing either." The Theocracy refugee encampment offered a different, harder conversation entirely. A young mother named Elsa Brenholt, speaking for families who had already lost so much to years of a war their own leadership had chosen for them, who met Ainz's honesty with a grief so raw it left him, for one of the few times since arriving in this world, entirely without any strategist's words to offer. "We came here because Cardinal Raymond promised this land was safe," Elsa said, cradling a feverish child against her chest, the first visible signs of the wasting corruption already beginning to show in the boy's pallor. "Because your kingdom promised the same, when the arrangement was made. I understand you did not create this affliction, my lord. I understand the choice in front of you is not one any leader should have to make alone. But I need you to understand, too, that if you choose the tribe over us, my son does not get the comfort of that understanding. He simply does not survive it." Ainz left both communities carrying a weight he suspected would remain with him, undead, unaging, functionally eternal, for as long as he existed in this world, however long that turned out to be. He found Beerus that evening on the mountain's ruined slope, seated on a fragment of the shattered peak, watching the corrupted land below with an expression Ainz had not seen from him before. Not judgment, not boredom, but something quieter and more difficult to name. "You know what I have to decide," Ainz said. "I do," Beerus said. "And I want to be very clear with you, Skeleton King. Before you ask what I think you're about to ask, I am not going to make this choice for you. Not because I don't care about the outcome, because the entire point of watching you this past month was never about whether you'd make good decisions when the answer was clear. It was about who you are when the answer isn't." His golden eyes turned toward Ainz, carrying none of the earlier months' careful, testing distance. Something rawer now, more genuinely present. "Whichever way you choose, you're going to carry the other outcome for a very long time. I know that better than almost anything in existence. Ainz Ooal Gown. I have made choices like this more times than any single mortal chronicle could hold, across more worlds than you could count, and it has never once gotten easier, no matter how many times destiny hands me the same impossible math. Then what do you do? Ainz asked quietly, when the choice has no honest answer, and you have to make it anyway. Beerus was silent for a long moment, looking out over the ruined mountain, over the twin encampments below where two communities waited, in their different ways, to learn which of them would be permitted to survive the week. You choose, he said finally, and then you carry it honestly, instead of pretending the choice didn't cost what it cost. That's the only thing I've ever found that makes it survivable. Not certainty, not a clean conscience, just the honesty to admit, afterward, exactly what the choice took from you, and from them, instead of telling yourself a comfortable story about how it had to be that way, and you're not really responsible for the part that still hurts. Ainz made his decision at dawn, alone on the ruined mountain slope where he had spent the entirety of the night turning the impossible choice over in every configuration his considerable mind could construct, searching, out of old and stubborn habit, for the strategy clever enough to avoid the cost entirely, and finding, at last, as the sky above the drowned spine began to pale toward morning, that no such strategy existed, and had never existed, and that Beerus's counsel from the evening before was, in the end, the only true answer available to him. He chose the Beastman tribe. It was not, he understood with total and unflinching clarity as he gave the order, a choice made because their claim to survival outweighed the theocracy refugees in any moral calculus he could fully defend. It was, in the honest accounting he forced himself to make and hold rather than bury, beneath comfortable justification, a choice weighted by a harder truth. The Beastman tribe had no other kingdom, no other advocate, no diplomatic channel through which their suffering might yet be answered by some alternative means. The theocracy refugees, whatever their present desperation, still had Cardinal Raymond's theocracy behind them, a nation, however wounded, with its own resources, its own healers, its own obligation to its displaced citizens that Ainz resolved, in the same breath as his decision, to hold Raymond accountable for meeting. He did not hide the reasoning. He traveled to the theocracy encampment himself to deliver it, standing before Elsa Brenholt and the assembled families with the full weight of his crown, and none of the distance a lesser ruler might have hidden behind, and told them, plainly, exactly what he had chosen and exactly why. That their child's fever was not a lesser tragedy than the tribe's affliction, only a tragedy with more doors still open to answer it, and that he intended, personally and immediately, to ensure the theocracy's own resources were mobilized, to walk through every one of those doors before the corruption's slower progress caught up with what conventional healing alone could no longer hold back. Elsa did not forgive him. Ainz did not ask her to, but she listened, and when he finished, she said only, in a voice hollowed by grief but not entirely without its own hard dignity, "At least you told me yourself. At least you didn't let me learn it from someone else, safely far from having to watch what it cost my face to hear it." The relics activation cured the Beastman tribe fully within the day. Grash Ironhide's people restored to health with a completeness that left the old elder weeping openly before his assembled tribe, gratitude and survivor's grief tangled together in equal measure once word reached them of the choice that had bought their survival. The theocracy encampment's fight continued by harder, slower means. Cardinal Raymond, informed personally by Ainz within the hour, mobilized every healer and resource the theocracy's still recovering leadership could muster, a response made possible, in no small part, by the genuine reckoning Raymond had undertaken with his own council in the weeks since the border garrison crisis. It was not enough to save everyone. 2 children among the refugee families, including, in the cruelest and most personal cost of the entire crisis, Elsa Brenholt's own son, succumbed to the corruption in the following weeks, despite every resource thrown against it. Ainz attended the boy's funeral himself, uninvited but present, standing at the edge of the gathered mourners in silence, offering no defense of his choice, and no comfortable words to ease Elsa's grief. Only his presence, and the unspoken acknowledgement that he had not permitted himself the mercy of forgetting what his decision had cost, however necessary he had judged it to be. Beerus watched the funeral from a distance, high above the modest gathering, Whis silent beside him, and something in the god's ancient weary face carried, for the first time since his arrival in this world, an expression that was not quite judgment at all. He didn't hide from it, Beerus said quietly, to no one in particular. Didn't dress it up as something other than what it was. Didn't let himself off the hook with some comfortable story about how it wasn't really his fault. He was silent for a long moment, watching Ainz stand at the edge of the mourning crowd, a king carrying a grief he had chosen, honestly, to keep. That's the thing I came here looking for, Whis. Not perfection. I stopped looking for perfection in mortal kingdoms a very, very long time ago. Nothing built by anything short of a god manages that. And even most of us don't, if I'm being honest about my own long history. What I was looking for was whether this world, and the man who's built the largest part of it, could hold the weight of its own worst choices without lying about what they cost. He can. He does. That's rarer than power, Whis. Rarer than any army or artifact in his entire treasury. Then your judgment is rendered, my lord, Whis asked, mild as ever, though something in his tone carried genuine warmth for the answer he already suspected was coming. It's rendered, Beerus confirmed. He rose from where he'd been seated on empty air, tail curling with the same unhurried, ancient patience that had characterized his every movement since the very first morning he'd opened one eye and smelled something wrong in the flow of a world he'd never intended to visit. This world doesn't curdle, Whis. It hurts, and it fails, and it makes impossible choices that cost real and irreplaceable things. But it corrects what it can correct, and it carries honestly what it can't. That's not stagnation. That's the opposite of stagnation. That's a world still actually alive, in every way that matters to something like me. He found Ainz that evening, once the mourners had dispersed, and the lich stood alone at the edge of the small cemetery, crimson eyelights fixed on a fresh grave in the fading light. You're still here, Beerus observed. I did not want to leave before I had sat with it properly, Ainz said. Grash Ironhide's people are alive because of what I chose. Elsa Brenholt buried her son because of the same choice. I do not think either fact cancels the other, and I have decided I do not want to be the kind of king who tries to make them cancel, however easier that might be to carry. Beerus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the full, settled weight of a month-long judgment finally, fully rendered. I've decided, Skeleton King, he said. Your world stands, not because it's perfect. It isn't, and it never will be, and I'd be suspicious of any world that claimed otherwise. It stands because everything I've watched you build, correct, mourn, and carry across this past month tells me this is a world still capable of growing into something better than it already is, rather than a world quietly rotting into something worse while it tells itself a comfortable story about its own righteousness. His golden eyes held Ainz's crimson gaze with something that had, somewhere across this long and difficult month, become close to genuine respect. I'm not going to erase you. I came here to judge whether this corner of existence deserved to keep going, and I have my answer. It does. Ainz felt something loosen in his chest that had been held taut, in one form or another, Since the very first morning, Demiurge had brought him a report of an anomaly the world's own instruments had no vocabulary to measure. A full month of accumulated dread, finally, fully released. "Thank you," Ainz said quietly, and meant it with a completeness that surprised even himself. Not merely for the verdict, for the month before it. I do not think I would have looked as closely at what I had built, or corrected as much of what needed correcting, without your presence forcing the honesty I might otherwise have kept avoiding. Beerus's ears flicked, something almost fond crossing his ancient, weary features. "Don't thank me too warmly," he said. "I'll be back eventually. Not soon, probably not for a good long while, given how this universe tends to keep me occupied. But worlds that pass my judgment don't get forgotten, Skeleton King. They get watched, a little more loosely than before, by someone who's decided they're worth the occasional check-in." He rose into the evening sky, Whis drifting up beside him with his ever-serene smile, the two of them silhouetted against a sky gone deep violet with the last of the sunset. The same color, Ainz noted with a strange, quiet appreciation, as the very first evening Beerus had arrived in this world, a month and a lifetime of hard-won honesty ago. "Keep carrying it honestly, Ainz Ooal Gown," Beerus said, as the space around him began to fold, the god preparing to return, at last, to whatever waited for him across the vast unmeasured distance between universes. "That's the whole of what any world, or any king, actually needs to survive judgment like mine. Not strength, not strategy, just the honesty not to look away from what your own choices cost." And then, without further ceremony, without the elaborate departure some lesser being might have staged, Beerus and Whis were simply gone, the sky closing over the space where a god had stood, the mountains settling into ordinary evening quiet, and Ainz Ooal Gown left alone at the edge of a small quiet cemetery, carrying, at last, a verdict he had spent a month fearing he would not survive to hear. Word of the god's departure spread through the Sorcerer's kingdom, with none of the panic that had accompanied his arrival. Only a slow, settling relief that took weeks to fully sink into a kingdom that had spent a month bracing for an ending it never fully believed it would survive. Cardinal Raymond continued his council's harder reckoning, the zealot faction's remnants fully dismantled by year's end, the slain theocracy beginning, haltingly, the long work of becoming something worth the honesty its own priest had once offered a god in a quiet chapel. Emperor Jerkniv's reforms, accelerated by fear and sustained, in time, by something closer to genuine conviction, cut deeper into Baharuth's old cruelties than even he had once believed possible. Coco Doll's undercity network slid slowly, imperfectly, toward legitimacy, one careful transaction at a time, and Zeshi Zetsume, restored to her order by a council that had finally learned to value her honesty over her obedience, kept her sword sheathed more often than drawn, choosing, day by day, to stay and fight for what her theocracy could still become. Grash Ironhide's tribe rebuilt on the mountain's healed lower slopes, their gratitude tempered always by the knowledge of what their survival had cost elsewhere. Elsa Brenholt remained in the Sorceress Kingdom, by her own choice, tending a small garden beside her son's grave, and Ainz visited it, quietly, every season's turning, never announced, never performing grief he had not earned the right to carry, simply present, the way he had learned, across one impossible month. That presence itself could sometimes be the only honest thing left to offer. Nazarick's order did not become gentler, exactly, in the years that followed. It became something harder to name, a kingdom still built on absolute power, still ruled by a being who had once feared nothing so much as losing what he loved a second time, but tempered now by the permanent, bone-deep understanding that power without honesty was exactly the rot a god of destruction had once nearly ended it for. Somewhere, in a distant corner of an unmeasured universe, Beerus slept once more, sated, for now, on judgment rendered and a world left standing, and content, in his own unhurried way, to let this particular story continue writing itself, for a good long while, without him watching quite so closely.